Welcome, and thank you all for joining today's Market Surveillance Committee meeting. Please note that today's call is being recorded, and currently all attendees are in a listen-only mode. There will be opportunity for public comment throughout today's call, and we will make sure to give you all instructions on how to make a comment at that time. With that, I'll now turn the call over to Amelia to get us started. Please go ahead.
Good afternoon and welcome again to today's Market Surveillance Committee meeting. This is the first meeting for two new Market Surveillance Committee members. I'd like to welcome Dr. Jacob Mays and Dr. Ross Baldick, who are joining our Market Surveillance Committee. I've put a link in the chat to the board memo that was the basis for their approval as members of the Market Surveillance Committee, if any of you on the line would like to know more about their background. And with that, I will hand it over to our new Market Surveillance Committee Chair, Dr. James Bushnell. Thanks very much for being with us today.
All right. Thank you, Amelia, and welcome, everyone. This is the first meeting of the Market Surveillance Committee and its new configuration. I echo Amelia in welcoming Jacob and Ross. On the line here is Jacob, and Ross is having technical difficulties, so rather than wait for those to be resolved, we decided to start the meeting, and hopefully he'll be here momentarily, but Ross is kind of in limbo at the moment, unfortunately. Also on the line here on the CAISO side is Hillary Staver, Amelia Blanky, Shami Davis, Guillermo Bautista Aldrete, Becky Robinson, and I think Partha's here too, Partha Malvetakar. And that, I think, is the representation. The agenda today is about congestion revenue rights. That's our one substantive item. But as always, this is the moment in which we open up the floor for public comment. So anyone who's interested in making a public comment on any topic, if it's about CRRs, we ask that you just kind of wait until we kind of dive into that topic. But if you have more general comments or comments on specific other topics, please queue up and we can hear what you have to say. And can you give instructions on how people can do that?
If you would like to make a comment, you can please press the raise hand icon at the bottom center of your WebEx screen. You will hear a notification when you have been unmuted, at which time you can then state your name and your comment. Once again, pressing the raise hand icon at the bottom of the screen is going to indicate that you wish to make a comment. At this time, I'm not seeing any hands up in the comment queue.
Okay, we'll probably have opportunities at the end as well, but we might as well dive into our main topic here, which is congestion revenue rights. And we're first going to have a presentation from Hillary, I think, and then I'll give a presentation that was meant to be short but turned out to not be. And I think then we'll see. Well, I'll play it by ear as to exactly when the appropriate time to pause and take comments might be. But we'll probably stop after Hillary's presentation at least. Take it away, Hillary.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, committee members. We appreciate your time and the opportunity to discuss this topic this afternoon. So as you have teed up, I'm Hillary Staver. I'm a lead policy developer on the market policy development team, joined today by my colleague Partha Malvetakar on the policy side and Becky Robinson. And I am representing also the broader team within CAISO that contributes to this initiative. So as was queued up, we are going to talk today about the ideas that we are currently considering in this initiative, and we appreciate your input. Next slide, please. First, just very briefly to ground us in where we are in the initiative process. We are currently in policy development. This initiative began in late 2024 and initially spent about a year in the scoping phase. You can see the second item there. And the focus of that phase was twofold. One was to develop level set on perspectives on the market as it exists today. So we spent about a year, a combination of hearing presentations from stakeholders, hearing presentations from our own market analysis team about the outcomes of the CRR market in the past 5 years since our last round of policy changes, benchmarking to other ISOs. And the output of all of that was a series of goals and problem statements designed to help us coalesce around what further policy enhancements would be the best way to move forward in policy development. So that wrapped up at the end of 2025, and we have now moved into policy development most recently with a straw proposal on auction efficiency and revenue adequacy released at the beginning of June. So our discussion today will in some ways mirror the structure of our most recent stakeholder conversation in the initiative, where we talk about some of these ideas that we've proposed to put forth, specifically the idea of a floor in the auction. And I'll note here that one of the main takeaway from the scoping phase is there are 3 major areas of focus in this initiative: auction efficiency, which we'll focus on primarily today, revenue adequacy, and also product definition. So we're going to talk most about one of those 3 areas today, but just I'll highlight that the scope is larger than that. So with that, next slide, please. There are going to be 2 major components of my presentation today. This first one here is going to be briefer. This is where we talk about our proposed structure for the policy development phase going forward. And as you'll see, the upshot of this is in search of balancing between getting improvements in the market as quickly as possible and making sure that we are giving these ideas time for thorough consideration of all of their facets and potential impacts. We're proposing dividing this initiative this phase into 2 tracks, one of which is going to move a little bit faster, and we're anticipating trying to get in place in time for the 2027 annual CRR process, and then another that will continue into calendar year 2027. So we'll start there. It'll be pretty quick, and then spend the bulk of our time on the idea of the auction floor. Next slide, please. So first, just to summarize what we heard from the working group conversations in the scoping phase about the timeline for this initiative. On the one hand, we heard a lot of interest in getting improvements implemented as soon as possible. We have a large range of potential enhancements that were put onto the record during the scoping phase, some of which are relatively incremental changes, some of which would be fundamental redesigns of aspects of the market. So we recognize that some are going to need more time and consideration than others to fully understand them as we're building them out. And then finally, the third bullet there, we recognize that however we structure this, there should be time for all ideas to be considered in their full range of potential risks and benefits, with the understanding that that timeline is going to look different for different ideas, per note 2. So if we move to the next slide, this is our proposed approach for how to balance that. As I said, what we're proposing here is to split policy development into 2 phases. The first of which will focus on solutions that we can potentially get into place in time for the 2027 annual CRR process. And the second that will continue into the next year and will allow for ongoing consideration of some of the more complex structural ideas that have been put on the table. And this is maybe a good place to note that one of the reasons that we focus on the annual process is that we have heard from stakeholders that it's important, to the extent that we can, to align changes with the beginning of the annual process, since participants are designing their participation for the year starting there.
Hillary,
Next
I
slide.
can't remember if this was brought up, but and I can't remember the answer. If you do have further developments during 2027, is the idea though that they would not affect any of the monthly auctions that interact with, that overlap with the allocations and the CRRs that are distributed in the annual auction? Or would you actually do some changes in the monthly phase for the CRRs that would be actually in circulation that year?
It depends on the nature of the change. In some cases, we are able to make changes on a monthly basis that will impact all of those. For example, we'll talk in a bit here about a change we made in March 2026. But in general, since we released 65% of the capacity in the annual process, we would like to try, and it's good to implement things there if we can. But they do apply to everything.
Sure. Yeah.
And if anyone else on the ISO side wants to.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I guess I was just wondering if there's something that changes the value of a CRR that was sold in the annual auction and then all of a sudden has kind of a different definition when you get to a monthly process or something that seems like that could be problematic. But yeah, I can see how it would depend on the nature of the change.
But I think you are identifying the key theme around why we try to have things in place for the annual process. Exactly. Because if that participation happens and then something changes the value of the CRR in the monthly process, I think you're identifying our key theme there. I see Partha has his hand up.
No, that's right. And I think that really this bullet to me was more of a signal that we're not pausing or stopping as a part of the first phase, but it'll be sort of a continued effort along with stakeholders to develop more comprehensive reforms throughout 2026, heading into 2027. So there was some question whether or not this was going to be do phase one, see if how effective it's working, and then continue phase two, depending on that. But this is more of a signal that we're going to be continuing policy development. But to your question, I think we'd have to consider that pretty carefully to do there's any sort of change that would happen in a monthly process that would impact the annual CRRs, for example. That would have to be carefully considered in terms of what the impacts look like. But yeah, that's the question.
Thanks.
Seeing no other hands, let's move to the next slide. We took feedback on the general idea of a phased approach where we have one track focused on faster implementation and one ongoing for more complex changes at our April stakeholder meeting in this initiative. And so we were able to get some feedback from stakeholders on how we might sort the scope items into this structure. What we heard from that is that generally speaking, the idea of a phased approach was well received. We heard a variety of different answers then from stakeholders on what should be put into the phase one approach that would move a little faster compared to phase two. So really, we saw all of the major areas of scope for this initiative represented among some group of stakeholders in that answer. So product definition, auction efficiency, revenue adequacy, as well as further analysis into the outcomes of the market over the past 5 years and the causes for revenue inadequacy. So we heard a variety of perspectives on that. And based on the combination of expected impact, likely ability to implement in time for the 2027 annual process, and stakeholder feedback, what we came up with and put out for stakeholder comment in our most recent meeting is what you see on the next slide, and what we're going to discuss today for the phase one ideas, which is to have phase one consider two main areas. On the auction efficiency side, the idea of a price and bid floor in the auction, and on the revenue adequacy side, looking at modeling improvements that we can make within the existing tariff, as well as a tariff enhancement that would allow for enhanced loop flow modeling authority in the annual process. So that's where we're going to spend most of our remaining time today, is talking through these proposed phase 1 items. And then when we look further out into phase 2, what we are proposing to cover there is our product definition area. This is where we are looking at potentially redefining the time of use periods that the CRO market covers, moving from a simple on and off peak to a third super peak, and then looking at more complex solutions around auction efficiency and revenue adequacy that need more time to develop. So I'll pause there. This brings us to the end of kind of the structural planning section, and we're going to spend today, the rest of my presentation, as I said, talking about the phase 1 ideas.
I guess I did wonder why product definition is something that needs to be pushed back, and is it because you need to come up with agreement or a stakeholder quasi consensus at least on what the definitions should be? Because it doesn't seem to be as technically challenging to introduce, say, like a third tranche of peak, super peak, than some of these other things we're talking about. So what was the thought process there?
It's an area that does have a lot of stakeholder interest, and we are continuing to develop out what those TOU periods should be, although I think there's been a lot of good feedback on that so far, a lot of it around whether specific hours in the shoulder periods should go with one TOU or the other. So I think that is advancing well, but in terms of the timeline, that would be difficult to implement by the 2027 annual process, especially in conjunction with the other things that we are considering. So it's ongoing policy development, but also implementation is a factor there. And if any of this, if anyone else would like to chime in there as well, feel free. But we recognize that there is a lot of stakeholder interest in that one.
Yeah, I mean, we'll come back to this maybe that, I think one of the issues about the whole auction floor, price floor idea is what the potential opportunity cost might be if it is that or something else or that or nothing else or sort of, yeah, whether there is maybe a focus that should be more directed at one of the other items or not. And I do think that's kind of something that's been floating amongst the stakeholder comments, and interested to hear what the discussion sounds like on that. But we'll wait. All right, so that did seem to spur Chris Devon to raise his hand, perhaps, or something else did. Chris, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I have to jump off for another meeting, so I did want to just chime in on this point really quickly here before I can rejoin the discussion. But anyways, sorry, Chris Devon with Calpine. We've been participating in this initiative pretty heavily and have a lot of interest in it as both a wholesale generator and on our LSE side, on the other side of the commercial desk, where we do hedge. Use CRRs to hedge to serve load and for our wholesale generators as well. So I think our opinion, which is outlined pretty well in our prior comments, but hasn't been made very clear on this phased approach, would be to say that we're a little bit concerned with the idea of moving forward with the auction price or bid floor on the next upcoming auction without having a little bit more vetting of that proposal. And it seems like there's maybe a risk that it could actually exacerbate the underfunding depending on where you set it at. And PISO's done some good initial analysis, but it was kind of unclear as far as if we could move this forward in an expedited manner. And it seems to be a little bit rushed, frankly. And the other thing that we are interested in is to hear some more discussion about the shift factor threshold, and we think that could be more appropriate to be done in a more expedited manner as opposed to the price and bid floor. But happy to have some more discussion on this later. I just wanted to throw that in here at the outset of the discussion since I have to drop off, unfortunately, for a quick other meeting here. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Hillary, why don't you keep going then?
All right. We will then, with that, move to the second portion of the presentation, which is to talk about our phase one ideas, particularly the auction price and bid floor. Next slide, please. So we'll start with just some overall grounding in how we got to this idea. This is something that we recognize the general idea has been in circulation in the conversation for a while. Auction efficiency as a topic, and specifically the idea of an auction floor, have been raised in both past MSC opinions as well as stakeholder comments in this current initiative during the scoping phase. So we recognize that the idea has been in the conversation for a while. It has the potential to be implemented in time for the 2027 annual process. So this is something that we could get in place in this year without needing to wait another full year to make improvements on the auction efficiency side. And there's an opportunity to start something incremental in phase one and build on it in phase two. So the way we're approaching this is if we were to implement something this year as part of phase one, it does not have to be set in stone forever, but it can form the foundation or augment whatever we do in phase two. So that is our general grounding. But if we're going to approach this idea, if we move to the next slide, we recognize that there are a lot of questions we need to think about as we go through the process of designing a floor and thinking about what it should look like. I won't go through all of these individually, but I wanted to highlight the four main categories that we have here. And I'd encourage, if there are any of these that you want to pull out and talk about more or add to the list, we can do that. But our four major areas here, we have counterflow, how the counterflow and counterflow interact in the price formation process, and what that means for how we should design our floor. The idea of how a floor would impact liquidity. We'll talk more about this in the next few slides, but generally speaking, we recognize that one of the uncertainties around setting a floor, perhaps the key one, is you don't know ahead of time whether participants who were previously participating, bidding below the floor, will increase their bids to the floor or will take their participation elsewhere, whether to move their bids to other paths or just not participate in the auction at all. So we recognize that potential changes in auction participation and therefore liquidity have implications for the auction outcomes, including the efficiency metric. That is our reason for undertaking this in the first place. And so that's one of the key things that we want to make sure we are attending to as we look into designing a floor. Related to that then, the idea of how a floor would impact clearing prices. This is something that we're going to talk about, especially on the next couple slides, around the idea of a bid floor versus a clearing price floor. We want to make sure that to the extent that we can, we're taking into account the ways that a floor could impact what clears. So again, this is where potential changes in participation are relevant. And then finally, the resale function of the auction. We recognize that the auction functions as a way not only for market participants to acquire CRRs, but as a place for load-serving entities who have acquired CRRs through the allocation process, as well as any market participant who has acquired one in the annual process and would like to re-optimize in the monthly to sell CRRs. And so we want to be cognizant of how any changes we make, including instituting a floor, will impact this function of the auction.
Yeah, Hillary, I've been focused on the last three bullets to an extent that I haven't really thought about the counterflow one as much. And I guess maybe you can elaborate. But so my first question though is, it sounds from what you've put here, if there were opportunities to use counterflow bids to sort of affect prices, is that something that gets exacerbated by a price floor? Or is that seems like I don't know how easy or hard it would be to do that anyways, or whether it would be profitable. But I guess I'm missing the interaction with the price floor sort of dimension to that first bullet. So maybe you could elaborate a little on that. Or is this more of a generic
Yeah.
sort of issue?
Well, there might actually, we have a scenario on that in a couple slides.
Hmm,
Would that be a
okay,
good place to cover that?
sure.
It's about
And
how well, yeah.
okay, yep, that's perfect. And Jordan Miners raised his hand, so why don't we take that comment?
Hi, Jordan Minus CPUC Energy Division. I know in this slide deck and in the working group meetings and other places, we've had a concern about liquidity being impacted by different minimum floors in the auction design. But isn't there an argument to say that there is too much liquidity on some paths because there's so little risk when you have a CR that's only at like at 0 or 10 cents? So market participants can bid widely on a bunch of low value, low price CRs, so increasing liquidity. But it's just there's just a lot of liquidity because it's so cheap.
I think, yeah, I don't know. I have a toy picture that tried to think through a dimension of this that maybe I'll get to too, but I think, yeah, it does kind of depend upon the nature of the participation. And in general, liquidity is kind of a term that refers to being able to trade a commodity without moving its price through your transaction requests. And here, I think it's being used in slightly a different way, which might just be sort of driving out bids and offers altogether, and having a sort of unintended effect on the net revenue that's gained from it. But yeah, I mean, the point is taken. Like, what's the point of having a whole bunch of zero price bids if it's not leading to either beneficial sort of use of the CRRs, which we'll talk about, or to raising revenue, which if they're zero price, they're not doing a lot of that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jordan. With all of these questions in mind, then, we are going to structure our discussion of the floor, if we move to the next slide, around 3 questions in particular. So first, we're going to talk about the concept of a minimum bid versus a minimum price, and why what we are ultimately proposing here is a combination of the two set at the same level. Then we'll talk through the question of where should we set a floor? What is the appropriate level if you're going to set a floor? And the way we're going to approach that is first by talking through what characteristics a floor should have in order to be effective. And then finally, at the end of the section, we're going to talk about the idea of negatively priced CRRs and how they should be incorporated into this conversation. But we will start with the question around the minimum bid versus the minimum price. And that is also, Jim, where we'll talk a little bit about the effects of counterflow to your question. So moving to the next slide. First, we're going to talk about the idea of a minimum bid alone. And this is the concept that has appeared most frequently in past conversations about an auction floor. So we're looking at this as a starting point. And what you see on this slide are 3 extremely simplified scenarios for flow over a simple path from source to sink. And the reason that we're going to walk through each of these is to ultimately explore why we think that a minimum bid by itself may not be as effective as another approach could be at increasing the likelihood that auction efficiency will improve. So first, we'll start in the center scenario. In all 3 of these scenarios, we are assuming for simplicity a minimum bid of $1 per megawatt hour. And the line has a capacity of 100 megawatts. So if we look first at our center scenario there, we're seeing a bid from A to B for 100 megawatts at the bid floor of $1 per megawatt. And in this scenario, it's very simple. The constraint binds at $1, which is to say at the minimum bid. The clearing price in this case is going to be $1, so the clearing price will equal the minimum bid. But if we look then to the left, the next 2 scenarios on this slide are going to show scenarios where a minimum bid does not necessarily guarantee a minimum price, and where you could have, despite the impact of a minimum bid, nonetheless the clearing price being below that floor. So first we'll talk about on the left, the scenario where in response to a minimum bid, some portion of that original 100 megawatt bid goes elsewhere. So reduced participation in the auction. So in this case, if we imagine now only 90 megawatts bid at the bid floor of $1 on this same line, the big change here is that in this case, because the bid is below the capacity of the line, the constraint does not bind in the simultaneous feasibility test. And as a result of that, what we see in this scenario is that even though the bid was for the bid floor of $1 per megawatt hour, what clears is at 0. The auction clears 90 megawatts at $0 per megawatt hour because the constraint no longer did not bind as a result of reduced participation and liquidity in the auction. So in this case, we're seeing the clearing price below the bid floor. And this scenario is important in our thinking about minimum bid versus minimum clearing price, because there is potential, depending on how much participation is reduced in the auction in response to a bid floor, that you could see more constraints not binding in a simultaneous feasibility test than has historically been the case. And if that happens enough, what you could potentially see is the overall impact on auction efficiency being to reduce it. And so this, of course, would be the opposite of the goal in establishing a floor, and therefore we want to be very cognizant of this potential impact, since it's moving in the opposite direction. We also have then, if we look to the right, this is where we talk about the potential impact of counterflow. And so what we're seeing here is, in this case, now we have 110 bid in the A to B direction and 20 megawatts bid in the B to A direction, this time at 20 megawatts, because that's moving in the opposite direction, so that'll be negative. And what we see here in this case is the constraint binds at 20 cents, which is below our $1 per megawatt hour threshold. So in this case, because the counterflow bid for 20 megawatts allows an additional 10 megawatts to clear in the A to B direction, we see the clearing price of 20 cents or negative 20 cents, depending on the direction, being below the minimum bid. So this is another way that a minimum bid by itself is not going to guarantee a minimum clearing price. And through that metric, if participation changes enough, we could see a net negative impact on auction efficiency.
Yeah, okay. And
I'll
so
pause
I
here.
kind of view this example as reverse engineering around the floor so that by putting in bids in the opposite direction, you could kind of get back to where you would have been if you just bid a price below $1. And I'm not sure if this is worth the effort if there is no floor. So yeah, I'm fairly persuaded that having a bid floor without a price floor is not a good idea. If you, yeah, sorry if I cut you off, but Don has his hand up. If now's a good time to sort of take another comment. Don?
Good afternoon, Don Trethewey, GDS Associates. This example confused me a little bit when we reviewed it in the stakeholder process as well. If the minimum bid to purchase a CRR is $1, then wouldn't I have to bid $1 if I wanted to buy from B to A? So I'm unclear how the 20 cents is created. Are you saying that someone's selling B to A? You know, because I could, does that make sense?
Yeah, I interpreted this as a negative 20 cent offer, and so the minimum would be above $1 or below something like negative 10 cents. And so either of those would be valid as a bid.
Yeah, and there's
That is
no
the
floor
intended
on the
interpretation.
negative, right? And so
So
Sorry
is
to
the
cut you off.
intent that from B to A would be you're trying to sell at -20, which is below the -10? And then if I wanted to buy from B to A, I'd have to bid $1.
If that bid were positive, correct.
Well, I want to buy from B to A. I'd be restricted to only being able to bid $1. Is that correct?
I think you could bid
Positive.
either. You could bid either a negative, something that was sufficiently negative or something that was sufficiently positive.
Right. Well, there's rules on, if in order to sell a CRR, you have to actually have been allocated one or purchased one in a previous auction. And so I'm thinking of a world where nobody is selling CRRs. Everyone is simply just buying. In the situation where everybody is just buying, no one would be allowed under a bid floor to submit a bid below $1 to buy from either A to B or to buy a CRR from B to A. Is that correct?
I will respond, but I see Partha's hand is up, so go ahead, Partha.
No, thank you, Hillary. It's a good question. I think this example is really being constructed around the idea that, one possible scenario could be we just had a bid floor and a price floor for positive value CRRs. We recognize that there's sort of two other functions that occur. One is that, parties can currently bid to provide counterflow CRRs, which actually makes transmission available in the market, as well as for resales of CRRs. And so that we were not wanting to sort of, as a matter of just out the gate, eliminate both of those functions as a part of this market. So this is more of a theoretical functions thing. If we're going to continue to have those functions and allow them to bid in effect, providing CRRs at a negative price to facilitate other transactions to happen, how could that work in this market structure, and what would the implications be to pricing? So that's sort of the basis. So in theory, we could just have it be all positive value, but that would in effect take away those other functions and have impacts to how the market functions. So that's really sort of the basis of our examples here. But thanks, Don.
All right, thanks.
Yeah, I think you covered it, Partha. I see we have a hand from Kelly.
Yeah, hi, it's Callie Wells with WPTF. Sorry, I just want to make sure I understand kind of what the proposal would be. So in this case, you said if I want to buy from B to A and I want to submit a positive price, it has to be $1 or above. If I want to buy from B to A, but I want to submit a negative bid, it has to be negative 10 cents or below. Am I understanding that correct?
Yes. And
okay.
I'm realizing it's not noted on the slide, but we have had 10 cents as our potential starting point negative floor, and the 20 cents here would not need to be adjusted for that since it's further from zero. So yes,
okay.
You're correct.
Okay, I thank you for that clarification. So, but if I'm thinking through that, then really what this is doing is saying if I want to buy from B to A, I can submit a bid whatever I want as long as it's not between negative 10 cents and $1.
It is around that range, yeah.
Assuming that's where we end up with
The two thresholds, yeah.
So I can
Right.
submit a bid from B to A to buy B to A for whatever I want, except for between 10 cents and $1, negative 10 cents.
Correct.
Okay, I appreciate that clarification. I have to think through that one a little bit more. Thanks.
Do we have a new hand from Don there?
Looks like it.
Thanks, Don Trethewey, GDS Associates. Well, your answer to Callie's question, unfortunately, confused me. So I will not know at the time that I submit my bid to buy from B to A that I am providing counterflow. So how would I be allowed to, would you accept a bid of -10 cents, but only use that if I was truly going to counterflow against A to B with my buy bid?
I'm sorry, Don, could you repeat that one more time?
Well, so I don't know if I'm buying B to A, if I'm going to be providing counterflow, because that's dependent upon if more people bid A to B than the transmission limit, and then I would be providing counterflow. But if that's not the case, then I'm not providing counterflow. So how would I know at the time that I submit my bid that I'm providing counterflow or not? That's what I think the right term here is what you're trying to say is, if I'm going to sell, then you have different rules for sellers, because they're not providing counterflow, they're just providing additional supply to the market.
Okay. I think I see what you're saying. The use of counterflow on the slide here is maybe a little bit confusing. Okay.
If you said
I think I see what you're saying.
If you said that if I have a sell bid of 20 cents, then that has a floor of 20 cents, then okay, I can see this happening. But I don't see it if it's a buy bid from B to A.
I see what you're saying. It is true that, right, we don't end up knowing what's flow and counterflow until after the SFT is run. What we're envisioning here, and I see how maybe then the use of counterflow on this side is a little counterintuitive, but what we're envisioning here, similar to what Callie said, is the floor that applies is based on the bid price only. And I should also note that it's maybe relevant here, we don't have it on the slide, that we do have a limits in the auction as well from the 2019 reforms on what paths are biddable in the auction. So,
right.
So it's also fair that depending on the nature of A and B, both A to B and B to A.
Sell. Exactly.
Right. So, but is that helpful? That what we're envisioning here? You're right that at the time that bids are submitted, participants won't know what ultimately ends up being flow versus counterflow, but the way the floor is applied is only by looking at the bid value itself.
I think you're saying it's only applied if you're buying. The dollar only, there's a floor when you buy and there's a floor when you sell.
For both positive and negative values.
Right. But I think if you had $1, if you have $1 bid floor, we're saying you can never bid negative, which means, which you can do today. You know, you could let somebody who doesn't have a CRR, that doesn't have hasn't been awarded something before and is ineligible to sell. They could in essence bid, you're right, a negative price from A to B that it would only clear if someone was willing to pay them. So that's I think this is what has me concerned about, that we're going to go immediately to draft final proposal at the end of the month, because I think it's really unclear what we're really talking about and what we're going to end up with clearing prices out of the simultaneous feasibility test until we get really precise on these terms.
And just to follow up, well, maybe you'll get to the proposal itself and how it fits with the negative price bids, because you are allowing negative bids. It's my understanding that there's going to be different bands on them than the positive bids.
Yes, that is what we're proposing, that you can have positive or negative buy bids, but different floors or ceilings, depending on how you want to talk about it, apply depending on the level of on which side of the zero your bid is on.
Okay, and this has spurred a couple more hands here, so I guess we can, Eric, I think you were next.
Hi, Eric Little for CalCCA. So now I'm heavily confused. We treat positive and negative as if we know what's a flow and what's a counterflow a priori, but we don't. So let me give you a very stark example. The expected value of the CRR is 0, and it has a distribution into positive and negative. What does that mean for which price applies, positive or negative? Because my understanding is the same as Don's. When you submit a bid, you're submitting a bid from a source to a sink, not a bid from a sink to a source. So you have to apply one or the other, and you have to know a priori which one you're applying, but you don't always know whether it's a flow or a counterflow. We're making that assertion as if we know what these are, and when you look historically, you can say, that was a flow because it was positively valued, and that was a counterflow because it's negatively valued, but I don't know that going into the auction. Sorry, wasn't necessarily a question there, but just a point that I'm not sure we've got the right terminology yet, kind of confirming what Don was saying.
Ross, you wanted to jump in here.
So maybe the way to think about the price floors is that there's a forbidden range of prices for bidding to buy between minus 20 cents and plus $1 for bidding to buy on any CRR. And my concern about that is I understand there are rules on what you're allowed to buy, but if you're allowed to buy A to B and you're also allowed to buy B to A, and you wanted to bid at 80 cents, you just pick the direction that you'd pick the putting aside the fact that we don't know what the counterflow is in advance, you'd pick the counterflow direction and you'd bid minus 80 cents to buy, and that seems to me to be similar to going in the positive direction at 80 cents. I haven't thought this through. I may be mistaken on that, but the larger point that I think everyone is making is that we don't know, in fact, the direction of this. I just contrast that to flow gates. If we imposed the price floors and the bid floors on the underlying flow gates, they have a well-defined binding definition. If they could be binding in both directions, you've really got two flow gates, so you could have an unequivocal requirement on every flow gate. I appreciate that you'd then have to retranslate that into bids on CRRs, but I think it would make this slide more coherent if we were talking about flow gates that were, let's say, in the flow gate in the direction A to B was what we were trying to find a minimum on. So two comments there. I'm concerned that having a different positive and negative actually enables you to finesse the in between, and I'm not 100% sure about that. I'm thinking out loud. And second, I wonder whether the ambiguity of the direction of binding would be resolved if the minimums were associated to flow gate constraints as opposed to CRRs. I appreciate that might open another can of worms, though.
And Steve Keen. Steve, you might be on double mute.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yep.
Hi. Okay, yeah, this is Steve Keen from Edison. I'm wondering if maybe, and I realize this doesn't work for all of the situations, but for a lot of them, the positive direction is going to be source to sink, right? That's, maybe that's the way we need to think about it, since from some of the changes we put in place in 2019 were that, you typically had to go from a source to a sink. That's kind of the positive direction. I realize there may still be situations where there's counterflow, but if you think about why people are buying these, which is to hedge against congestion, typically you'd be hedging the congestion going from the source to the sink. you know, if you expect the congestion to be the other way, I'm not sure you'd be interested in buying a CRR or paying for a CRR. Now, it gets a little complicated because some of these things potentially, you know, bind in two different ways, and I'm not sure how to deal with that. But I think maybe that, at least I'd like to think about that as a possible way of kind of getting past some of this.
Yeah, it's true that the places that you can buy and sell to are greatly limited. I guess there's still some subset of trading hub, maybe pairs that you could kind of go in both directions, but I don't think there's a lot of them. But I guess I should know this now too, but after all the changes, if I did want to bet on that price, that congestion in the negative direction, I could still essentially pay or get money from the ISO in the form of a negative clearing price, and then and then pay back the congestion, right? That's what the negative price CRRs do, and that's what. So that would just be a buy at a negative price, sort of from A to B. Then, in this example. And is that allowed, or is that something that Don was saying that you need to actually own a CRR through an allocation process or something to take that kind of position now? I guess I should know this, but I don't remember.
Yeah, I guess that's the thing, and if that would seem to be the type of thing that would occur in the one willing buyer, willing seller market structure, is where people would be, you know, bidding on both sides, you know, there'd be entities taking the risk on both sides.
Yeah. And so I don't know, Hillary or Partha, is that an allowed thing where I can basically, I'm bidding a negative price, I'm injecting at a source, taking out at a sink, but I'm basically betting that the congestion will be smaller than I'm taking a position where I have to pay the ISO the congestion from the CRR. Or is that's not something that's possible with the new kind of 2019 rules where and I'm not sure if my question's clear, but
I'll give it a shot, and I know Partha also had his hand up for a while, so maybe I'll speak to that and then I'll hand it off to you, Partha. But I want to note, so both buy and sell offers can have positive or negative directions, positive or negative prices. But in order to take a sell position, you do already have to have a position in the system to sell. So you have to hold that CRR already, either through the allocation or having acquired it in an earlier auction, as can be the case, you know, if you get something in the annual and then are reselling it in the monthly. So you can get positive or negative prices in both the buy and sell functions, but for the sell function, you do have to hold that position already.
Okay, but that just affects sort of the capacity that goes into the simultaneous feasibility test in some way, I guess. But so I could basically bet against the congestion with a buy at a negative price then, though. And does that mean this example could be reconstructed as a buy at a negative price from A to B?
I see what you're saying. Let's see, depending on the nature of points A and B, I think potentially, if I understand what you're saying correctly. But I see we also have a hand from Phil Roth.
Although maybe that doesn't create counterflow. So yeah.
Phil, is this a response to the same question?
Good afternoon. Yeah, this is Philip Roth. I'm an engineer on the CAISO CRR team. So I think I can help maybe provide a little bit more detail and hopefully answer some of the questions that have been coming up. First of all, to the question of, can you submit a buy bid with a negative price, and what does that indicate? Yes, currently, and with this proposal, you continue to be able to submit buy bids for CRRs at a negative price which means if those bids clear, then you would receive a payment for taking those positions. And the likely assumption there is that you may be exposed to a risk in the based on the day-ahead market clearing, but rather than receiving payments for that CRR when there's congestion would be the opposite direction, so you'd have a liability. So in this example on the slide, just maybe to reiterate it, one participant would be bidding A to B at a positive price, and they would be restricted by the bid floor of, in this example, $1, and someone else would be bidding in to take the opposite position, willing to take that risk from B to A, bidding in at a negative price. And in our proposal, it's been a separate restriction on negative buy bid ceiling or floor, whichever you want to call it. So they would be able to do that at a 20-cent price. In the example of sell offers and buy bids and how those all interact, I think that's where it might get a little bit complicated as far as what would exactly be allowed there. But in general, what Hillary said is true. It's not like an open market where you could submit sell, like you cannot effectively take either position and get the path of prevailing congestion and get around the price floor. So if you already have a path, yes, you could sell it without the floor restriction, but you wouldn't be able to obtain additional CRRs in the prevailing flow of congestion that are expected to pay out and sort of get around that floor price, is my take on it.
And I guess in my head, I had this being, what if it's the same participant who submitted both bids and they both cleared? Then that's how I kind of thought you could reconstruct 80 cents out of it. And I mean, I guess you could try to police that, but okay, this got a lot of different hands up. Maybe Becky, did you want to jump in on that, or?
Yeah, if I could, Becky Robinson with the ISO. If I could just, Bill, thanks for clarifying that. And maybe just to draw out a point that I think I heard from your comments, Phil, but that maybe the prior discussion, there was some confusion about, is the notion of if I have a CRR, from A to B, does whether that clears at a positive price or a negative price in the auction determine which side of the day-ahead congestion revenues I'm on? I think the answer is no. I think if you have an instrument from A to B, you get the same, you have the same congestion exposure, whether that's a payment or whether that's a charge, regardless of the clearing price in the auction. So Jim, to your point of just because the price may clear negative in the auction, does that mean I am paying the congestion revenue from A to B that materializes in the day-ahead market? I don't think so, right? I think the fact that it might clear at a negative price indicates market expectations for what is that congestion exposure. But whether it clears at a positive or a negative price in the auction is not determinative of whether I'm paying that or being charged that. Phil, is that, can I get you to confirm if I have that right?
Yes, that's absolutely right. So the auction clearing price really just determines your settlement for obtaining that CRR. And it is no way related to the settlement that's associated with holding that CRR based on the day-ahead market MCC of the LMPs for the effective hours for your CRR.
So maybe one further clarification to the example, again, to the discussion before. Putting in a bid at a negative price, right? We're talking about both the floor on the positive side and a ceiling, if you will, on the negative side. You can put in a positive bid or a negative bid, right? Depending on your expectation of day-ahead congestion revenues. But putting in a negative bid to buy is less likely to clear than a positive bid, right? So that would be going, if you will, further down the curve. So right, if you think, well, I'll just put in a negative bid, that to get
So
the
they're not
instrument.
both going to clear.
Well, or they could clear, but they'll
Unless the
both
price
clear
is
at a
up
clearing
above
price, a single clearing price, right? There's not two different clearing prices for the same instrument.
Yeah. So, right. And so that in that way, it's different than trying to sell in the opposite direction.
Thank you.
Where I think you could have both positions. Okay, let me just say a couple more things. We've got a few people lined up here, and Jacob, you had your hand up. You're on the MSC. You don't need to raise your hand. You can jump in anytime you want. At least that's the precedent I set a long time ago.
I retracted my question, so
okay.
Go ahead.
Just letting you know. And Doug Boccignone, thanks for your patience.
This is Doug Boccignone from Flynn Resource Consultants for the Bay Area Municipal Transmission Group. Yeah, I think this discussion about the directionality is really important because, I mean, because you can buy from A to B or from B to A, and you really can have two different prices that are affecting each other if we have different floors or different bounds for these. So I think that makes me feel like we need to have a symmetric treatment. And instead of like worrying about all the potential consequences of having asymmetric treatment, I think we should be focusing on finding the positive and negative floor that makes sense. And then we don't have to worry about it sort of distorting the market. Because I think if you say I'm willing to buy from A to B at 25 cents, and I'm willing to buy from B to A at minus 10 cents, or that's just a mismatch. Right? Those two things are going to interplay with each other in a way that I think would be a workaround, except when you overlay the price floor on top of it, maybe not.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's worth remembering that this whole example was basically meant to motivate why you need to have a price floor in addition to a bid floor. But I do think, I mean, the asymmetries made me wonder. I'm clearly confused myself even more from the last half hour, but yeah, I have wondered about that. But also, as I think a few people have mentioned, in a lot of cases, you can't buy from B to A because of the restrictions on what is a physically feasible CRR, but there may still be some pairs that are that where you can do it in both directions.
Well, you've got interties and potentially storage resources if that ever has changed. But and I guess the other thing that this sort of makes me think about is I think some of the desire to have a lower negative value is if people to facilitate transactions where people are trying to unwind, positions that maybe have a slightly negative value or are very close to zero. And I do think if there were a way to have essentially a different no floor when someone's actually selling a CRR that they hold versus the ISOs selling the system CRRs, then I think we wouldn't have to worry so much about this. In other words, if the software could work, so if you didn't have a minimum price that someone could sell at if they actually hold the CRR, then this wouldn't be a problem.
Yeah, I mean, that is one of the issues I think both Hiller and I raised too. And I don't know how technically feasible it is. I don't know if that's the only reason to, I'm not sure what the motivation of the separate negative values was here or what the concerns are, but my sense is that there's just less concern with the negative priced CRRs in terms of causing auction revenue shortfalls or.
I mean, but there's not an insignificant number of and value of CRRs that you know, the ISO pays people to take, and then they end up, you know, providing value to the people who take those CRRs. And I'm not sure what the liquidity benefit or the benefit to the market or the benefit to the people who pay for the transmission is from having those CRRs.
Okay. So we have a couple more hands up. Philip, did you want to jump in on this one? And then we'll get to Eric, or...
Yes, I did want to respond to the question regarding, is it possible to implement this in such a way that there would not be a restriction on the sell offer prices? And we do think that is possible. So what that would look like is when a CRR bid, buy bid, or sell offer is submitted within the CRR system, it would not be difficult from an implementation standpoint to just have a restriction that only applies to buy bids. So again, we're talking about two things here, a bid price floor and a clearing price floor. So the first part of that, the bid price floor, that would be very straightforward from an implementation standpoint, where we would allow sell offers to be submitted without enforcing a restriction on the price that goes along with them. You know, keep those just how they are today. In regards to the clearing price being enforced, that's also where we think that's possible from an implementation standpoint. Conceptually, if a buy bid were to clear below the floor price, like what's being shown on the screen here in the example on the left, then we could enforce that minimum clearing price by adjusting the clearing price of that buy bid. So once the SFT is executed, the system determines what that clearing price is. If it is less than the floor price for a buy bid, then that buy bid clearing price would be adjusted up to the floor price, and that's what would be passed on to the participant as the clearing price for obtaining that CRR. But we would not necessarily have to apply that same adjustment to sell offers. So if you submitted a sell offer into the auction based on the SFT execution, your sell offer clears, then if it clears whatever price it clears at, that could be the clearing price. We wouldn't have to apply that same adjustment to the clearing price that we're proposing for buy bids. But I did want to weigh in with that implementation detail.
I guess, okay, if I'm just trying to understand this. So for every sale, there's a buyer. So the buyer of a resold CRR would be able to buy it at a price below the price floor? Is that just...
No. So maybe to clarify that concept a little bit, sell offers into a CRR auction do not need to have and are not directly associated with a corresponding buy bid. Both sell offers and buy bids are all evaluated against existing transmission capacity, and they're not like a bilateral transaction.
Sure. Yeah, I guess so. They might be reconfigured, may not have the exact same thing transferred or anything like that. And so are you basically just saying that if I'm submitting a CRR as a sell, you could waive any of the offer, the bid floor sort of stuff? But
yes, and maybe to your
clearing price
example,
limits.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I think to your example, I can maybe elaborate what that would look like. So let's say you were selling A to B and I was buying A to B. And let's say the clearing price of A to B turned out to only be 50 cents. So you could bid in and say, I'm willing to sell A to B for 20 cents. and that would clear because the clearing price was 50 cents. So you would sell A to B at 50 cents, and then someone else, let's say they're buying A to B, they would have to bid in at $1 because that's the floor. Let's say the clearing price was 50 cents. So they clear because they're above the clearing price. Then the price would get adjusted up to $1. So you would sell successfully at 50 cents A to B, and someone wanting to buy the path A to B could still clear that, but they would be buying it at $1.
Sure. Okay. But I think the case people have been talking about, including myself, that we've been wondering about is, what if there is somebody who wants to buy it at 75 cents and I'm willing to sell it for 50 cents, but it seems like that transaction would not happen.
So based on the concept of the floor price, you would not be able to bid in at 75 cents. That's correct.
Right.
But there
And
is
so
still
if that's the most I want to buy it for, then I'm just kind of out of the auction. And so there is a set of resales that would be excluded from this, that I think your exemption doesn't quite resolve.
That is true. So yes, that could be maybe an indirect outcome, would be the ability for entities trying to sell a CRR to clear it if it's if you want to call it like a low expected value path. I will mention though that outside of the auction, there is in place a secondary market system. So it, I mean, it would still be possible if you found that willing counterparty to, deal directly and sell at some agreed upon price outside of the auction, but it wouldn't be possible to accomplish purchasing that CRR below the floor price within the auction.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. I think we're on the same page with that one, and just kind of work through the implications. Eric.
Thank you. Eric Little from CalCCA. So my warning here is that this one seems so obvious that I have a feeling I'm being dense and missing something completely, but it's never stopped me from asking dumb questions before, so I'm going to. What occurs to me right now is that I'm not sure that we can get to what the original objective was here, right? The original objective was, we have a problem with revenue adequacy because people are bidding pennies on the dollar on a CRR, and they're clearing because there's not enough people bidding higher than them, right? There's not enough people to force this to the competitive outcome. So if we now tell people that they have to bid above $1 or below -20 cents, don't we just end up exacerbating the problem? There's still not enough people who are going to bid the positive side of this. It's now going to clear at a negative dollar amount because, once again, I can't tell what's a flow and a counterflow a priori. So I simply get a whole bunch of negative bids, and instead of clearing at pennies on the dollar, I clear on negative dollars on the dollar, and I actually make my problem worse.
Yeah, well, I think the price bound is meant to deal with that to some degree. So it wouldn't, unless I guess you're saying unless it drives the price even below the negative price bound. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Right, that's what I'm worried about. Is the person who's bidding pennies on the dollar right now says, well, if you're going to set the price floor at $1, I think this is a 75-cent CRR. I'm not going to make that bid anymore.
Yeah.
But if you tell me that I can bid less than -20 cents, I can bid -21 cents, and I can clear this thing, well, I'm happy to take 21 cents in the auction and 75 cents when the CRR actually experiences congestion. So are we actually solving the problem by doing this if there's not enough bids to push you to a point where this actually clears at a positive amount?
It seems more likely that it just wouldn't clear. I mean, unless there's enough positive bids in the other direction, the engine just wouldn't select those negative offers, right?
So it's simultaneously feasible, right? So it's got a negative bid on something that's simultaneously feasible that doesn't violate its constraint of the price. My understanding based upon this slide is that will clear.
Well, it's still the objective is trying to maximize, so it's not going to select a negative bid unless it is enabling some positive bid elsewhere.
Okay, can the ISO confirm that they have a constraint that says if this ends up being a net cost to the ISO, that it will not clear?
Philip, thanks
Phil?
for braving the.
Yes, that is correct. I can confirm that. So within the auction SFT, it's an optimization algorithm. So if a bid would reduce the net money coming in and not allow other positive value bids to clear, that would be greater than money going out for that bid, then that negative bid would not clear. So what Jacob said was correct.
Okay, then how are we dealing with people who got in the allocation process? Because I know this occurs. They get in the allocation process through, trading hubs and that sort of stuff. They get bits and pieces that have negative value, and they want to liquidate those in the auction. So it's going to have a negative value. They're going to be willing to sell it at a negative price in the auction. And I know this is a slightly different issue that will come up later about does this price floor apply to people who got something allocated and now wish to sell it? Because if that's the mechanism, now people who got negatively valued CRRs can't get rid of them. They're forced to hold them.
Let me think about that just a moment. So selling at a negative price and buying at a negative price are two different things. And actually selling at a negative price
Would increase
would
revenue.
result in a transaction where right, exactly, that participant is paying money into the auction revenue. So that's it's not the same as a buy bid with a negative price, which is getting taking money out of the auction revenue.
Okay, thank you. That helped. I appreciate it.
So just at a high level, then the objective function is to maximize kind of as bid revenues subject to simultaneous feasibility. And so anything that actually reduces that objective function would not be selected. That seemed to be the summary there.
Can I offer one amendment to that? It's maximize revenue subject to it never having a negative contribution is what I heard. Right, because maximizing revenue could be minimizing losses as well.
Ah, okay. So if the total objective function starts to go negative, then yeah,
it stops. That's what I think I heard, which I think answers the question that I had. All right, thank you.
Okay. Thanks for everybody's patience. Don.
So Don Trethewey again. I think if we think back what the original intent, I think of what was trying to be addressed here is that there was concern that in the auction that the CAISO was releasing unallocated transmission capability at in essence a $0 bid price. And so if we, and it's going to be a little simplistic to do it with just a single path A to B. But really, because in essence, that breaks down to what the flow is on the actual constraints in the simultaneous feasibility test. But at a simplistic level, let's say that in the allocation from A to B, the CAISO, the allocation only allocated out 90 megawatts, and the amount that could actually flow from A to B is 100. Well, then CAISO would make some available at $0. That could actually, clear, and we get a low price. But if you actually had said that, well, for that 10 megawatts that didn't clear up to the 100, that needs to come in as supply at $1, then you would get the results that we're looking for here. In essence, that you would never clear an additional 10 megawatts up from A to B unless somebody bid above $1. Except if you had somebody bidding a counterflow at 20 cents, that you would clear somebody who bid higher than 20 cents up to that 20 megawatts, up to that 100 megawatt flow, because no one bid above $1 for A to B. And I think that's what allows you to then allow people to continue to bid as they do today, in either a buy or a sell. It really gets back to a question of what price does CAISO offer into the auction unallocated transmission capability. Because I think that's the objective is I think if I listen to the IOUs, they don't want CAISO selling if only 90 megawatts cleared in the allocation from A to B, they don't want CAISO selling it at zero, offering it into the auction at zero. They'd like CAISO to offer it into the auction at $1. But they wouldn't want to then restrict their ability to offer to sell because they may have a position that they want to unwind from the allocation. And putting on these bid limitations restricts their ability to do that.
Okay, I'm gonna mull that. Alan from PG&E. Thanks, Don.
Hi, Alan Meck, PG&E. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Thank you for this discussion. This has been fascinating. I'm just trying to take a step back and keep this in my head. It seems like we're investing quite a lot of time and effort trying to get around DMM's willing buyer, willing seller proposal. But ultimately what we're landing on is we want to preserve the ability for willing buyers and willing sellers to transact in the market. But we're also trying to build in the functionality for CAISO to run the auction on its own in parallel to that, with some bid floor and bid ceiling restrictions. But it seems cleaner to me, why don't we just do the willing buyer, willing seller proposal then?
Okay, well, I'd say we're far from consensus on that being the, the preferred endpoint. I guess but I will say this, there is an element here that actually kind of goes beyond willing buyer, willing seller in the sense that it restricts the willing sellers to some degree, according to the examples that have been kind of kicked around a little bit. And so in that sense, it does force them to a secondary market. And I think the spirit is kind of what Don articulated, where there is an additional amount of capacity that could be sold, but shouldn't be sold at a loss. I mean, it's sort of the zero price is less of a concern than the fact that the price is way below what the subsequent congestion revenue turns out to be. And that seemed to be the motivating factor here is there a way to sort of try to eliminate that? And as I'll get to in my slides, I think the original reason we floated this kind of minimum price concept without having sort of fleshed through the ugly details that we've been discussing was this original hypothesis that there was a lot of the CRRs that were creating the auction shortfalls were kind of these bets on congestion that were clearing at extremely low prices, and that there was a lot of volume sort of trading at these very low prices, and just kind of were people willing to put a very small amount of money on the line in the chance that there's going to be a payoff. And as we'll talk through, it's not clear that is actually the dominant source of the revenue, the auction revenue shortfall. And so I think the original kind of hypothesis behind why a minimum price might be kind of a good way of trying to deal with this, I think there's still an open question as to whether that's actually true, whether that original hypothesis is actually true, because there's been some kind of analysis that seems to indicate that it's not really the auction shortfall is not dominated by these extremely low priced CRRs. It certainly plays a role, but not maybe a disproportionate role. So that's kind of on the side of, okay, well, how far does this actually accomplish? I think if you go towards, therefore, let's just do willing buyer, willing seller, that's kind of, I think, a much more dramatic change that is not something I think we should try to resolve in the next 6 weeks. I think at one level, I've been trying to work through whether some form of a minimum price is kind of a sliding scale version of willing buyer, willing seller, in a sense of if you set the price at $10 million a megawatt hour, then you basically sell nothing in the auction, and maybe you're back to willing buyer, willing seller. But as we've sort of discussed, it's actually, there are elements here where we're excluding the willing sellers by kind of imposing the same transaction limits on them as we are on the capacity that the CAISO is making available post allocation phase as well. And that's all to sort of respond to your comments, which I'm also kind of just trying to think through this at the high level, where at one point, you could kind of think of this as a sliding scale, but it does lead to in different directions. And whether it does accomplish the goals of reducing the auction revenue shortfall, as several people have kind of raised, I think is still an open question as well. It could maybe be answered a little bit more with some more dives into historic bidding data, but that also would assume that those bids don't change under the new rules. So there's always some risk in trying to do that. We could probably get a better sense of it, but I think there's definitely, it's not clear exactly how far into the goal this gets us.
So I thank you for talking through that. I think what I'm hearing though from you, Jim, is that the original goal or the original problem that we set out to solve, the original problem statement was we're having a number of these CRRs clear at very low or maybe even $0 bids prices, and that's maybe causing the auction revenue inadequacy to inflate, and that was the impetus for this minimum bid idea to try and get around that. I'm on board with that. But now you're saying that I guess we'll stick a pin in this discussion until we get around to your presentation. But I think that what I'm hearing you say is that maybe the whole entire goal behind this was misguided to begin with, which then doesn't that push us even further towards, well, why not just do the willing buyer, willing seller? It seems cleaner too, and is guaranteed to address the problem. I understand I'm not going to sway everyone's opinion on, this one discussion in this one instance. And
yeah, I mean,
it's premature, but
yeah.
I wanted to keep that in people's minds.
So without sort of getting to the willing buyer, willing seller too much, I think what I would say misguided. It was back at the very beginning of this, before Guillermo did some of his deep dives into the root causes and so forth. There was a lot of speculation just basically kind of brainstorming on what could be causing these shortfalls. And there was a hypothesis that it was kind of disproportionately due to very low priced CRRs clearing. And that, you could imagine as somebody who wanted to sort of take a lot of bets, you could just put a lot of very low price bids in, and some of them are going to clear at near zero or zero prices. And then, you are taking some risk on with those too, because they could go negative. But if you were reasonably confident that the congestion was going to be positive, you just sort of spread your chips around and try to get a payoff on the ones that do end up clearing at very low prices. And that was just kind of a working hypothesis that both Guillermo's kind of results and I'll talk through, I'll show a few things that I was just preliminary kind of data exploration, still trying to kind of process where it means. But it's not like a huge amount of the revenue inadequacy or the auction shortfall is due to that sort of thing. That seems to be where the analysis has taken us now. And so that does raise the question of, exactly how much of that problem would be solved by this is, I think, is worth asking, and it may be less than some people think. And therefore, we kind of want to weigh the complications here and whether there's an opportunity cost about potentially other things that could be done, versus trying to sort out all these details.
Okay. I don't want to take up more time on the call. It sounds like what we need to really do is move things along and wait till your presentation, Jim.
I guess that's my fault. So as I'm kind of running the meeting. Okay, so I'll take that cue. Hillary, let's let you talk for a while.
All right. Well, I think the conversation we've actually gotten further. I think we've gotten further into the presentation, but maybe just to bring us back, really the biggest takeaway in terms of where we're going immediately next on this slide is we started from the place of what could a minimum bid do by itself, and based on part on the types of scenarios that you see on this slide, concluded that there was enough uncertainty that a minimum bid by itself would be likely to improve auction efficiency, that we then moved on to looking at a minimum clearing price. So why don't we go to the next slide? And I think we've actually talked through, in some of Phil's comments, we've already talked through these scenarios. So maybe I'll just do a quick summary, and if it's worth sort of digging into any of these, we can. But the main takeaway from this slide is that, again, if you start from the center, the scenario looks the same. But in this slide, we're considering a $1 minimum clearing price in addition to a $1 per megawatt hour minimum bid price. And what you see here is the center scenario looks the same. The left scenario, again, the constraint doesn't bind, but this time it clears at the minimum clearing price of $1 per megawatt hour rather than at 0 in our previous scenario. And as we already talked through, the scenario on the right, in this case, you'll see that the B to A clearing price is the same, but the A to B clearing price is now $1 per megawatt hour per the minimum for a positive bid. The other piece of this is the reason that we are proposing to do a minimum bid and a minimum price together is that if you had a minimum clearing price without a minimum bid, then that creates an opportunity for auction participants to end up being charged more than they bid. Because if you submit a bid that clears, but that bid was below the minimum clearing price, and the clearing price is increased to the minimum in settlement, then you could have a scenario where someone is charged more than they bid. And so in order to avoid that, while getting the benefits of a minimum clearing price, we proposed to have those together set at the same price. So the minimum bid would be the same as the minimum clearing price.
And we
So
had,
that is,
can I ask, maybe you'll get to this in a couple slides, in which case feel free to defer it, but we did have the point of concerns over the asymmetry here. And if we imagine that on the far right example, it's the same market participant or close affiliates or something, that they could sort of, it seems to me, maybe I'm wrong here, that they can kind of reverse engineer an 80-cent net here. So what was the motivating factor with the with the negatives being at different levels? And am I wrong here? Is that not, are they not reverse engineering an 80-cent transaction, or is it because they're both taking on the flows, I guess? So, yeah, they would actually net out. So if this is the same participant, would they end up just paying 80 cents and not getting any congestion revenue? I guess I think that's maybe where we end up. So that wouldn't be a great strategy. on those 10 megawatts, because the congestion revenue would offset from the two opposite direction CRRs. And on the one hand, you're getting paid 20 cents for it, and on the other hand, you're paying $1 for it. So maybe that wouldn't be something you'd want to do, as I'm thinking through this in real time.
Well, and let's compare that, if you don't mind. Let's compare that. I think this is relevant to your earlier question, Jacob, too, or maybe comment about the symmetric floors. Part of the reason for setting asymmetric floors in the proposal is that the price distributions around zero look different, and we have some figures on that in the upcoming few slides. So maybe that would be a good place to talk about that. Does that work?
Sure.
Okay, we can pick that up there. Seeing no other hands, if we go to the next slide, this is just a summary that for our first question here about whether a bid or a price floor or both is the most likely to achieve what we're trying to achieve in this, which is an increase in auction efficiency while preserving the core functions of the auction. We arrived at the idea you see in the straw proposal, which is that we have both set separately for prices above and below zero, but matching for each of those. Price and bid floor are the same. So that brings us to the second of our three questions. If we move to the next slide, this next section is going to be about if you're going to do a paired price and bid floor, where do you set it and why? So the point that we're starting from is looking at what characteristics a floor should have. Moving down our list here, just as a starting point, we are looking for a universal floor. The idea of constraint-specific floors has come up, but it's not feasible, especially not on the timeline that we're looking at. So we're coming to this question from the idea of a floor that is applicable to all paths in the auction, that it improves auction efficiency while preserving hedging access and resaleability, the functions of the auction, and we recognize that's a balancing act. So this is part of why you'll see we have sort of different options for floor that we talk about and are looking for input on which one strikes the best balance between these. And then finally, we think a floor should be reasonable in the context of two relevant historical data sets that we're going to look at next. The distribution of historical CRR notional values, which is to say the actual day-ahead market outcomes before you account for any revenue inadequacy, and then historical CRR auction clearing prices, because by comparing our floor to those historic clearing price distributions, we can get, it's not exact, but can give us some idea of potentially the impact that a given floor level could have on the auction. So we are in the stage of looking for feedback on, well, first of all, whether this is an appropriate list, whether there should be other things on there, and if it is, then which of the options that we're going to see in a few slides best achieves the balance of these goals. Moving forward to the next slide. So now we're going to talk through those two historical data sets that I mentioned, starting with historical notional value. And just to frame this out, I want to note that we are looking at historical data for context on market outcomes. There isn't a quantitative methodology that can give us one ideal value that we've identified, but we wanted to look at both of these data sets through the lens of the goals we're trying to achieve here. So the first data set is historical notional value. We're looking at a subset here, which is the 1,000 most traded paths by frequency. I'll note that's frequency of trades that's different from either volume or price. This is for the period of January 2023 through March 2026. And we're looking at normalized to dollars per megawatt hour, which allows us then to compare it to normalized clearing prices in the auctions. So you can see we've separated this out by season and by time of use period. This is for the current 2 time of use period structure on and off peak. And you've got you got the full spread, all of the percentiles. So a couple things to point out about this as we're looking at it. One is that if you look at the maximum row all the way at the bottom of the table, these events in the maximum level here create a really long-tailed distribution of notional value. And I want to point that out because we think that is, it's very relevant for thinking about what a CR is likely to be worth, but it also makes it more complex to choose a single value that is representative of the distribution, since so much of the value of these CRRs can happen in these tail events. But you can see as we look through the whole table here, another overall feature is that there is a significant differential between time of use periods on and off peak. So one thing that we took from this is that even though we are looking for a price that can be applied across all floors, there is enough price separation between on and off peak to do separate price floors per time of use period. So that is one starting point here. We're going to be looking at 2 different floors on and off. And I'll pause here maybe. Does anyone have any questions or comments about this data set?
Sorry, and I might have missed this. Is this both seasonal and monthly combined, or one or the other? Which kind of flavor are we looking at here?
Thank you. This is combined, and that is one of the benefits of normalizing to dollars per megawatt hour.
Yeah.
So we can compare.
Okay, I guess we can go on.
Seeing no hands. Okay. All right. The other historical data set, if we move to the next slide, is historical price distributions in the auction. So the next few slides are going to look at historical auction clearing prices for the period of 2019 through 2024, which is starting with the implementation of the current structure after the 2019 policy reforms. These are figures that originated in our market analysis team's root cause analysis last year. And these have been normalized as well to dollars per megawatt hour, so you can compare. And maybe I'll flip through each of these in rapid succession and pause. I'll note that if anyone, well, I guess the presentations for this meeting are posted. I was going to say it's hard to get more than one on a slide, but can be useful to compare. So I'll flip through each of these in succession. We're starting here at the annual price distribution for the on-peak period. You can see, a significant distribution across each of our price tranches. If we move to the next slide, this is our annual price distribution for the off-peak period. You can see the prices drop in the off-peak period, so we've got significant clustering in that first pink bar, the 0 to 25 cents, compared to the more even distribution on the previous slide. And then if we move to the next slide, we'll look at monthly distributions. In general, we see prices increase in the monthly auctions compared to the annual auction. So you can see here compared to the annual price graph, you see more clustering in the dollar and above category, the highest price category in our distribution here. And then finally, if we move to the next slide, we have the on-peak we have the monthly distribution for the off-peak period. And here again, we can see the clustering closer to 0, representative of that of the value differential between the on and off-peak periods. So there's variation between the annual and monthly. In general, we see higher prices in the monthly as we get closer to the time period of the CRR settling and hedging risk becomes clearer for participants. So if we move to the next slide, the final 2 figures that we have in here when we're considering how historical clearing price information and auction outcomes are relevant to setting a floor is we looked at this metric of payout minus auction revenues. So essentially profitability of CRRs that cleared the auction in different price categories. And I think it was you, Jim, already touched on this question a little bit. And so the thing that we see in these graphs as a starting point is there isn't an extremely clear pattern of which category is consistently showing an excess payout that could provide a clear starting point for a floor. This is our annual distribution, seasonal, and if we look on the next slide at the monthly, we see a similar pattern where it's not concentrated in a single price category. So what we took from this, and interested in hearing feedback, but what we took from this is that if we're addressing the question of where is an appropriate level to set a floor, there isn't a clear answer coming from this information. And that brings us back to trying to find a value that is reasonable in the context of our two previous data sets that we looked at, the historical notional value outcomes from the day-ahead market and the historical clearing prices. In light of all that,
sorry, Hillary, I'm pretty sure this is clear in the documentation, but these payouts all do not include the clawbacks, right? This is just nominal values, or were you able to calculate what the phase 1B pullbacks are in these sorts of payoffs? I guess actually Guillermo's analysis, I think, did, but.
That is correct, that this does not include clawbacks.
Okay. And is there any sense of whether those clawbacks are disproportionately, centered towards, I guess this is slightly different, but when the payout is, some of these CRRs just had mammoth payouts, and in nominal terms at least. And I don't know whether those kind of were linked to outages on certain constraints that actually triggered a outsized clawback as well. In other words, were the clawbacks highly correlated with the size of the payouts or the size of the excess auction value? And I'm putting you on the spot here, but that's the data on the clawbacks is the mystery element here, and I just would be interested to know whether excluding them biases this in some way, or if that's going to take some more digging.
Thank you. That's a good question. I would ask, actually, do we have anyone from market analysis on? I believe we do, who can speak to that question about how this would change under the clawbacks. If not, we can follow up on that.
Kyle.
Yeah, thank you. Hello, everybody. My name is Kyle Pelham. I'm with the market analysis team here at the CAISO. Yes, so to speak on that, we should have a piece of analysis that covers the distribution of how these haircuts are applied. I don't have it in front of me, but that is something that we can follow up on. I can dig at the moment as well, and we might be able to get you an answer, but there should be material out there that covers that.
Okay. I mean, not to put you on the spot, so no one take him literally here, but off the top of your head, did you notice, was it more random, or did nothing jump out, or was there kind of a clear relationship between big payouts tended to be correlated with bigger clawbacks? Or you don't want to say?
Yeah, I'm not too sure.
Okay.
I know a lot of the clawbacks, historically, if you go into the root cause analysis and look at some of the causes for, revenue inadequacy, a lot of that is driven by, market conditions that aren't necessarily represented, in the CR process that, come to fruition in the day ahead. So there's that necessarily isn't, something that's, typically super, predictable, but, to answer your question more directly, I'd have to follow up and take a.
And I think what you just said, it feeds my intuition that they would be correlated because the big payoffs would be linked to some surprisingly, expensive constraint. That if depending on why the constraint's expensive, I guess is sort of whether it's linked to a clawback or not. But
Gotcha.
okay, I won't put you on the spot. We'll look for that later.
Cool. Thank you.
Hillary, I said I was going to let you talk, and I broke my own promise.
No, it's good. Well, that is our last, that's our last data figure here. So if we move to the next slide, in terms of where we're going with this examination of historical data, is the question of, in the context of all of that, what is the best option as a starting point for a bid and price floor? And so what we have in the straw proposal is not a single value we've put out, but as you can see, a range of 3 in each time of use period. And we're looking for feedback on which of these, or if anyone feels there is a case to be made for a different value, would be the best starting point in context of everything we just saw. So as you can see, one thing about these differences is the off-peak options are much lower. That is due to the difference in the on and off-peak historical notional values and clearing prices. So the way that these are structured is that these values for each time of use period correlate to roughly the same percentile of the distribution in the notional value chart that we looked at first. So we're looking at from 25 cents to $1 for on-peak, and for 5 cents to 25 cents, from 5 cents to 25 cents on the off-peak period. And maybe if we go back could we go back to the notional value chart? I think it is maybe 15, 16, sorry, there we go. For example, if we just take season 1 on peak, you can see that 25 cents is landing us around the sort of 15 to 30th percentile, depending on the season. If you move up to 50, then you're looking closer to the 25th to 40th percentile, depending on the season. And then $1 gets us closer to the 45th to 60th percentile, depending on the season. And then maybe moving one slide forward again. Actually, well, yeah, this is a good place. So you can see in our price distribution graphs, we have it broken out so that each of these bands represents the breakpoint between 2 of the options. So for example, our 25 cents to 50 cents band, if we went with a 25 cent on peak floor, then this whole pink band here between 0 and 25 would be eliminated. If we went with 50 cents, we eliminate the yellow band. And if we went with $1, then we eliminate the green band as well. So when looking back through these price distribution graphs, those are broken out in a way for on peak that you can see easily what would be above and below the floor. And for off peak, those values are lower due to the historical notional value difference. It's lower compared to on peak, so the prices are clustered in the pink band. If we go to the next slide, like so.
Hillary,
so maybe we can go.
I know you said this, but can you kind of repeat the motivation for why all the paths should have the same price?
It is largely an implementation constraint. It's not feasible for us to set specific constraints for every path. And if Kyle has anything else he'd want to add on this, feel free. But we did consider that at the outset, and it seemed like that is just not something from a technical perspective that's going to be feasible. Which does leave us with the complexity of trying to find a value that is a reasonable floor across all paths, given that you see significant value variation across paths.
Although a lot of the variation in the value is due to sort of like is unpredictable. And so even if you did want to sort of, some of it's not, you can clearly identify some kind of predictably more valuable and predictably less value. But a lot of the real extreme payout stuff is kind of less obviously predictable, where you would say, let's put the floor there.
Over time, agreed. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's significant temporal variation even on the same path.
We have a question, but how close to being done are you, Hillary? We could maybe let you finish up first, or...
We are getting close. Maybe, is that a good structure? I think I had
Yeah,
about...
let's power through and then we'll take Eric's question. Sorry, Eric.
Well, then why don't we go back to slide 23. So we're looking at a range and feedback on where is the best starting point. There's one more idea in this section, and then one slide on phase 1 revenue adequacy enhancements left in this section. So why don't we move to the next slide? I think we've already covered a lot of this, but the point here, as has been discussed, is that we're contemplating a ceiling on negative prices, which is to say a minimum difference from zero, or a minimum distance from zero, excuse me, for negative pricing. We recognize that negative pricing, plays an important role in the current auction. We want that to continue, but in looking at the historical clearing price distributions, we can see that the negative prices, which are also on those figures, are clustered much closer to zero. So getting back to the question of a symmetric floor, a big part of the reason, one reason that we chose to propose an asymmetric floor for negative prices is that if we set a floor that is appropriate in the context of the positive historical clearing price distributions, that is going to eliminate a far greater percentage of the negative prices, because those are clustered closer to zero than the positive clearing prices. So what we have in the straw proposal is the idea of a ceiling for negatively priced CRs that is much closer to zero. What we've put in there is the idea of negative 10 cents per megawatt hour, but we're open to feedback on the exact level there. But the main goal with the ceiling on the negative prices is to prevent them from clearing at zero. So that is what we're trying to achieve with that, both prevention from clearing at zero, and by having an asymmetric floor, prevention from eliminating most of the historical distribution of negatively priced bids. And I think we've had some discussion on this already, but maybe despite what we just said, Jim, maybe I'll pause there. Because I know there was some interest in this.
Yeah, and there's a couple hands that are up already as well. So Eric, you've been waiting patiently, and then Jordan.
Yeah, thank you, Eric Little, Cal CCA. So I think there's some critical analysis that's missing here, right? We had an original objective of this, and now we've gone straight to choosing a price. But what we don't know is if you set the price there and looked at the last auction, what would the results have been? Would it have improved revenue insufficiency or not? Because it's entirely possible that what you've done is taken people who got an allocated CRR and were willing to sell it for a low price and prevented them from doing it, right? So theoretically what we're doing is we're saying, well, the ISO is the person who is holding responsibility for CRRs that belong to somebody else. We don't want you to auction them for $0, auction them for something more. But where it's already been allocated to somebody, that individual should have the right to be able to sell that for whatever price they want to sell it for. And right now, what we understand from the proposal is that CRR held by some LSE would be subject to this very same price floor. So the question that we would want to know, and we'll be submitting this in comments here coming up next week, is have you done the analytics, or can you do the analytics to figure out what would the results of this have been if you set these various price floors on the last auction? And how many of those would have prevented the auction inefficiency and the revenue insufficiency, and how many of those would have prevented an LSE that got something at allocation from selling what they were allocated? So the analysis is nice, but I don't think it's complete.
You stole my thunder. I was going to say something similar.
Oh, sorry.
No, that's great minds think alike. And yeah, I think exactly right, with the caveat, of course, that, you know, when you apply new auction rules to historic auction data, there's always the fear that the bids themselves will dramatically change. But at a bare minimum, it's sort of like, I think it actually puts a bound on how beneficial the outcome could be to sort of apply it to these historic data to kind of see. And I do think it's something that's really missing here. Jordan.
Hi, Jordan Minot, CPUC Energy Division. 2 questions, but 1 question I thought. If we go too high on the initial values or too low on the minimums, how easily is CAISO able to update them?
Good question. Do you guys have a sense? I mean, this gets back kind of to the monthly versus annual and so forth. Like, you know, if you put a different kind of price floor on the annual auction, I think it opens a can of worms to try to monkey with the monthly, given that a whole bunch of them have already been sold under the old rules. I'm not sure if the CAISO has thought through this, but I would think they would be stuck with kind of an annual cycle.
Maybe I can, I can start with this, and maybe Phil, if you have anything to add, I'll hand it to you. But I think there would be opportunity just mechanically over time to adjust the floor. Once we have this functionality in place, we have some ability to adjust the floor over time if we feel that a different value would be more appropriate to the goals of having a floor. But that said, between the annual and the monthly, I think the same thing applies there as we talked about at the beginning with the existence of a floor in general, which is that in general, we would like to try and keep it consistent within an annual cycle between the annual process, the floor used in the annual process, and the monthly processes, because that's kind of one linked process for market participants. But Phil, anything to add there?
I agree with what you said, and yeah, from like the implementation and mechanics of that, yeah, we were envisioning this as something like a configurable parameter that could be updated for every auction and time of use. So at least from that aspect, we wouldn't foresee that to be a challenge if there was a reason to change it between the annual or the monthly or month to month or whenever a decision was made to change it.
Okay, follow-up question on that, Philip. Since the configurable parameters are not in tariff, they're set by BPM, are you envisioning these minimums would be in the tariff or in BPM?
That I'm not positive on. It most likely a BPM.
I would say I agree with Phil, but I think unless we have anyone from legal here who wants to weigh in, that would be to be determined.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
if you have any comment on that, Jordan, that's welcome.
It's a good question, but yeah.
It's just, you know, we've just dealt with the configurable parameters now for several months, so it's just like this value that is not in the tariff that can be adjusted quickly. So because locking in a value is sometimes preferable for more certainty than having the ambiguity of a value that could change on a faster timeline. But thanks.
That's where you're coming from. Thank you.
Okay, and then we have a question from Seth Cochran, and then maybe we can try to get through this segment. Go ahead, Seth.
Seth Cochran. Yeah, thank you, Seth Cochran with VTOL. So, one thing I'm stewing in my head is, what if you have this price floor in here, or bid floor, and then it prevents people from bidding because they view that the risk of this having to clear a certain price would be over their valuation. And so, in a sense, you have less bids coming into the auction. Is it possible then that there would be some constraints that don't bind as a result of that. And if the constraints don't bind, then there's no auction value derived. So I was wondering if you thought about that. So, I mean, you can take this to like a very extreme case where you set the floor super, super high. No one would bid on that because it would be over the value that they placed on the hedge or whatever purpose they had for the CRR. And so in that case, there'd be no bids and there'd be no auction value derived. So there's a point here, I think, where if you set this floor at certain levels, you have less participation, less people bidding, and there may not be constraints that bind as a result of that. And if that's the case, you don't have that benefit, the auction value. Have you thought about that?
I can take that. Thank you, Seth. We have. I think that you have hit on a central theme, which is the potential impacts of we set a floor. If that causes then a change in participation and fewer constraints to bind in the auction, what is the net impact then of our floor on the auction outcomes and the auction efficiency? So I think that is, I think that's a major theme that you've pointed out, and there is some inherent uncertainty ahead of time around what change in participation a given floor is going to lead to. That's hard to know exactly, but I think a really key feature of answering the question, what is an appropriate floor level?
Yeah, and so going back to Eric's comment request, I think, a starting point would be to just throw out all the bids that are below floor X. So if you set the floor at $1, throw out all bids below $1 and then run it under the assumption that if they're bidding a price below $1, their willingness to pay is below $1, and see what the result is. Again, the bids might change. There might be some people that would actually bid above it, but that seems like a point of information that would be useful to know.
It's one end of the possibility spectrum.
Yeah. Well, I guess if it's a uniform price auction, and I'll go faster now through my slides because I'm going to try to talk a little bit about this, but then, you could be bidding $5 and still clear at 50 cents, but you're willing to pay $5. And if you're bidding 50 cents, though, it's less obvious to me why you would bid 50 cents if you're really willing to pay like $1.50, unless it's really such a illiquid auction that you're kind of trying to strategically influence the prices there. And maybe that's the case, but so part of it is what these bid curves look like and how steep they are, basically, whether there's a lot of action above the market clearing price or whether they're actually quite flat at the market clearing price. And I think running the auction under sort of different assumptions is the first step to trying to answer that. Okay, Steve, I want to take a break, so let's try to do a couple quick ones here, and then maybe we can take a break and come back.
Hi, Steve Keen, Edison. This is kind of building on what Eric was saying. I think what we're trying to do here is eliminate some of essentially the rent-seeking behavior that we've noticed in the auction without stopping the people that are actually hedging or buying these things for hedging purposes. And one of the fears that I have is just setting this price floor across all the things. I don't know what it's going to be getting rid of. The expectation, I think, is what you said, Jim, is that there's a lot of these people that are paying nothing for something and hoping they hit. And that if we set that minimum price for it, it'll eliminate a lot of that. But I could also see that maybe what's happening is there's a lot of people who are worried about, potential, what would happen when lines go out, and they're putting in low price bids for very low probability events to protect themselves from prices going way up. And so that, they're putting these bids in for very low prices, but those are actually, you know, more revenue sufficient or more efficient. That's one thing I think we would need, you know, that I'd like to see if we could do some analysis and check on and see, you know, what gets eliminated. Because the other option that's out there that people have suggested is a BAMX proposal that if you want to, you know, if you want to participate in the auction, you have to demonstrate that you actually need it, you know, you want to use it for hedging, that you're participating in the market. That, you know, they're both designed to do kind of the same thing, which is remove some of the transactions, but leave the hedging. And I'd just like to have some information as to, you know, how effective this price floor is going to be at doing that.
Okay, Hillary, you want to wrap up this segment, and then we'll take a short break.
Yep, we are nearly there. If we move to the next slide, this is just a summary of what you see proposed in the straw proposal as a starting point. So we've already talked through this, our options for the positive floor and the negative ceiling. And then if we move 2 slides forward, there is a second piece of what we're proposing in phase 1, but the reason that we've spent most of our time on the floor is I think that is the area where there is a lot more you know, range of perspectives. What we're looking at in revenue adequacy is twofold. One is just a continuation of an ongoing effort to try and improve our modeling where we can within our existing tariff authority to help it converge more closely to the day-ahead results, which decreases the likelihood of revenue inadequacy. So we already began this with a measure in March to apply the global derate factor to contingency constraints in the CRR model. It's only been a couple of months, so it's really too soon to see a long-term trend, but we did see some positive results for that month when we started it. And then the second piece is to make a tariff update that would expand the ISO's authority to do explicit loop flow modeling in the annual process, whereas today we have that for the monthly process. So that is looking at generally just looking ahead, maximizing our ability to model loop flow as accurately as we can in the CRR process going forward. So there was a lot of support for loop flow modeling in general in the scoping phase. So this is something that we see as kind of just maximizing our ability to keep improving that function. So that brings us to the end. And really my last slide here going ahead is just kind of a review of the other pieces that have been moved into the phase 2 scope. If we move 2 slides ahead, that will be picked up in the second phase of policy development. And that concludes my presentation.
Great, thanks, Hillary. Got put you on the spot for a little longer than probably anticipated. I think we had a lot of great questions and discussion while we went, so we'll take a 10-minute break now and start up. I've got 3:15 on my clock, and we'll start up at 3:25. And I guess if anybody's got a burning question for Hillary, we could start with that, but otherwise we'll start in with my presentation and discussion. All right, so we'll see you in about 10 minutes.
It's just after 3:26 and we have one hand raised if we want to get started.
Okay, looks like there was still some follow-on discussion. Thanks, Amelia. I should say once again, actually, you've heard from both new members, Ross and Jacob. I guess we do have a couple hands raised, so we'll start into that, and then I'll do a quick run through. Amelia, we're scheduled to go to 5, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Justin, you were first in line.
Hi, thanks. This is Justin Cockrell with DC Energy. I do have a burning question for Hillary, as you said we could ask. After hearing this feedback, it sounds to me like you've gotten feedback that there needs to be more comparative analysis to understand the potential effects of one level versus another. Do you have any plan to back away from your expedited timeline?
Is there anyone willing to take that one on?
This is Parth. I'd be happy to take that on. No, thanks for the question. I think we're still working through the process right now. I think we recognize the fact that we had a stakeholder meeting. We have a proposal out there, and we're still looking for comments. This is a part of our due diligence to understand what the implications are, the risks and concerns of participants, and whether or not we can address it. So I think it'd be premature for us now to say, like at this meeting, that yes, we're going to change course based on the feedback we have, but we're going to certainly consider the input of stakeholders, the input of the MSC, and our own analysis simultaneously in terms of charting a path forward. So no, thanks for that.
Okay, yeah, because I would really appreciate getting more of a comparative analysis and really just a better understanding of what you're trying to get out of this proposal and how one version compares to another. But thank you.
Okay, we had, I think it was Steve Keen was in queue, but he's dropped out. He's welcome to rejoin, but I'll just dive in the meantime. So this is very preliminary thoughts. I don't want to be kind of this is initial reactions is really very much the intent here. Some of this is going to repeat some of my high-level thoughts on CRRs that I've covered in previous presentations over the years, and so I'll try to go a little quicker on that. And then there's going to be some data analysis that's very preliminary, and is kind of trying to get at similar stuff Hillary was, but using some slightly different measures. Okay, next slide, please. I've just realized I am not allowed to advance slides here. Is that right? Oh, there's a little button at the top. Maybe I can. Okay, so just going to do a little high-level framing here, and then talk through a couple data cuts that I was playing around with on the minimum price proposal to try to get my head around some things that I think the discussion helped elucidate. And then I want to touch on a few things that haven't been raised, some of which have been part of the stakeholder process and others that really haven't been at the end here. Okay, so I've said this before, and it's anyway. I think that the discussion around at least the revenue inadequacy and especially the auction revenue shortfalls has really kind of been all structured around the fact that transmission ratepayers, on average over the years, have ended up getting less value from selling CRRs than if they were just allowed to keep the congestion revenue directly.
Jim, I think if you advance the slide for yourself, it's only for you and not for
Oh, okay. Darn. Well, that's a really bad loop. Okay, so sorry. Looks like I can advance it, but no one else will see it. So Please go to slide 3.
Hey Jim, I've made you a co-host, so you should be able to click the take control button now up top, and then that should advance the slides for everybody.
Okay, great. All right, so hopefully we
You
see
just
a
need to
slide
click
that
the
says
take
framing.
control button first so that we can see you advance.
Oh, take control. Okay, got it. Do I want to take control? Yes. Okay.
Great, we see you advancing now.
Excellent. Thank you. Learn something every time I use a different video meeting software. All right, so here, framing, basically the idea here is, or the observation is that we've done a lot of work, a lot of excellent work quantifying the different dimensions of the revenue shortfalls, the auction revenue shortfalls, the revenue inadequacy. I mean, we've measured it. We still don't know exactly what's causing it, which is unfortunate. And I just want to make this observation again that yes, eliminating CRRs or reducing the scope or the access to them in some way, I don't think anybody's proposing eliminating them, has some cost as well. In other words, CRRs do provide benefits to the market, both theoretically and we believe in reality. And therefore, reducing access to CRRs does have some cost. And so legal questions around open access aside, which I'm not qualified to answer, but am willing to opine on, but not here, that the economic impacts is a cost benefit question. The problem is, of course, and I've really struggled with this over the last 5 years, that quantifying the benefits of access to CRRs is very difficult to do in an empirical sense. I'm not aware of any serious empirical study. There's been some actually good dissertations written about CRR auctions and the relative pricings of them, but not. It's just really hard to answer the question of what in the physical world changes because of access to CRRs, if anything at all. And I think there are some people in this process who believe nothing changes, that they don't actually do anything. But to the extent we do think there's some beneficial aspect to them through hedging or other sort of ancillary hedging related activities, it's really hard to measure this. I'm not aware of markets that have gone from having no CRRs to have CRRs or in the other direction. And so we don't really have a great setting to try to study this. Maybe my colleagues have some better ideas here. But I remember back when I was, writing papers with Steve Stoft, there's this idea of CRRs as being the other link to being able to develop power projects, do other types of power transactions that allow for dealing with basis risk in a way that allocates risk in a sort of welfare improving way and leads to more efficient investment and so forth. And that was kind of the vision of it. Very hard to sort of sort out what the speculative versus hedging behavior is and what the actual incremental benefits of access to those hedging instruments is. I will say that when we were thinking of this in the 1990s, I think the paradigm very much was more of a long-term, what we now come to call a long-term CRR, where you build a power plant and over the course of the next 5 to 10 years, a bunch of other entry happens and other things happen, and all of a sudden the nodal price you thought you were going to get is very different. The way to cover your risk against that is to have a CRR. And that's much more in the long-term CRR realm, though, which strikes me as just much more useful for financing investment and other types of activity than a periodic bite at a 3-month CRR auction. This process, to my knowledge, has really given almost no attention to the long-term CRR process. I know in some of the stakeholder comments along the lines, there's been some desire to look at that, but I'm not sure, and I'm going to come back to this, how any of this will impact the long-term CRR sort of process or how important they really are. It strikes me as they should be, because in the absence of long-term CRRs aside, we're really talking about an ability as a physical hedger, that's not a load serving entity, but even if I'm a load serving entity, it's an ability to participate in a seasonal process to get 3 months of hedging, or 4 consecutive chunks of 3 months of hedging and so forth, rather than really locking in a multi-year sort of hedge against basis risk that might evolve over multiple years. And I think I've wondered about exactly how much value that has. And this comes back to, like, if there's not a lot of value to it, then is it worth the losses that transmission ratepayers are apparently experiencing, rather than just collecting the congestion revenue? So that's a high level observation. I wish I had better answers to it, but it's sort of been in the back of my mind on all of this, that we can't just sort of say that it's all cost, that there are benefits to these, and we should recognize that, even if we can't necessarily easily quantify it. And Dan Williams has his hand up, so maybe he has some ideas on that. Dan, go ahead.
Hey, thanks, Jim. And this is the first call with Ross and Jacob. So I'm Dan Williams. I'm from the Energy Authority. Energy Authority operates nationwide. We're a wholesale market services provider. We're not-for-profit, owned and operated by Public Power. In California, we participate in a lot of energy trading, RA market, but all of that is centered around the activity that we do for our CCA clients, who are load-serving entities in California. And as part of all that, we are active in the CRR market. We use CRRs. We derive a lot of value for our clients out of being able to use CRRs to hedge. And I have a ton of thoughts on this, but I'll keep them very brief, just to sort of Jim's last slide of, is there value in it? Yes, there's value and there's benefit. And if we were to intervene in this system, either through the what's being proposed here or the more extreme structural changes, we don't know exactly what would happen, but we do know that entities that, like us, who are using this market and pairing CRRs with power purchases and assembling portfolios to try and offweigh risk, would have to just do that in a different way. And that either shows up in higher prices in other areas, or taking on more risk that results in higher prices in other areas more indirectly. So I'm very much on the side of wanting to take caution in how we intervene in systems. And I'm going to put that in comments that we submit, that we don't support moving this proposal forward, and would rather see the focus be on the product definition changes, and even some minor process changes that we think are even lower hanging fruit than what could be picked with those product definition changes. And the last thing I just wanted to note is that right now, a lot of CRR market participants and market participants in general are going through a whole bunch of disruption and change with the day-ahead market enhancements products, with the EDAM congestion revenue allocation that's pulling value out of CAISO constraints and leading to increased underfunding on CRR positions right now. And we're only, by the time we get to October, going to have 2 quarters of operating under that new paradigm before we're moving into the next annual auction. And inserting another change, to me, feels like a risk that doesn't have a whole lot of reward. But I'll put that in comments. I just wanted to weigh in when, Jen, when you had that up there of kind of who benefits. Well, entities that are helping load serving entities benefit.
All right, I stirred up some interest here. So Michelle has lined up next. Go ahead, Michelle.
Hey, this is Michelle Keto from Energy Division. Hey, I just wanted to make 2 comments. So one of which is, I think BAMX did some really good work on who benefits. And as far as that analysis goes, it really shows that in terms of the auctions, it's primarily the financial entities. And so they look to see if these folks were doing physical transactions using EQR data. So that's the first point I'd like to make. The second point is that the CPUC has prohibited the utilities, who are among the largest, customers and people that pay for the transmission system, that we prevent them from engaging in any speculation. They're allowed to hedge only. So, just curious if you have any thoughts of whether that reduces the efficiency, because they could also, if they see a great deal, they could speculate just as well. And they are the beneficiaries. So right now, if you look at the costs and the benefits, it doesn't look great because, low priced auction revenues and high payouts. So somebody could buy something across the board and on average, they seem to all do well. But one of the largest participants in the market is not participating. So anyway, I just want to make that point.
Yeah, maybe we can come back on the second point, Michelle, because I guess to the extent one adjacent point that I'm going to make later has to do with wanting to know more about the allocation outcomes. And I do worry that the way the allocation process works now is inefficiently designed. And to the extent that the allocation process ends up with inefficient outcomes, whether your restrictions on the IOUs do have a knock-on effect on trying to overcome any inefficiencies from allocation. And then I guess the secondary thing is, under the extreme sort of outcome of what would be the equivalent of a really, really high minimum price of basically having nothing clearing in the auction phase, then we are putting a lot of weight on the allocation process, because the CRRs that do come into the world are basically being originated in the allocation process, and there isn't really a whole lot of opportunity for reconfiguration, at least in the
unless you have the willing buyer, willing seller, like.
Well, no, under willing, and as I understand it, under willing buyer, willing seller, you're basically restricted to the sets of nodes that come out of the allocation process and the quantities associated with those nodes coming out of the allocation process, unless you've got financial entities willing to sort of participate kind of in a risk-taking way.
Yeah, I guess I was looking at the BAMX study that showed that I believe that the auction sales are, mostly from the allocation. So if you allocate and then have a willing buyer, willing seller framework, that seems to make sense to me. But anyway, we'll continue on. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. And Chris.
Hi there, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great, thanks. Chris Devon, Alpine. So, I just wanted to comment on your Jim, about how you see that there's more value to the long-term CRRs, and I think you did describe a lot of the reasons why there's value there for signaling congestion investment decisions and hedging long run. But I think I want to just also mention that these shorter tenor auctions are helpful, and other regions have more frequent auctions, and we've been advocating for balance of period auctions due to the fact that we often, on our LSE side of the house, serving load, we do have situations where we enter into a contract for shorter terms, be it a couple months or 6 to 12 months, and then if we enter those and execute those in the middle of these auction periods, then we run into a potential unhedgeable situation, and it is when we are physically serving load. It's not just speculation. So I do think that there's some value there I wanted to flag. And on top of that, I would also just mention that we do believe as well that there is value in liquidity that's provided by the financial parties, because somebody has to be able to take that counter position. And if they're not willing to participate, or we are overly restricting these things, putting administrative things in place to limit participation, we have concerns around that, and we think we should be opening it up more to allow for the participation of those entities that add that value. And a lot of this discussion and rhetoric is not really ever taken into account the fact that there's that value, that benefit that's brought by those parties. And I think it's been argued back and forth, but I'll just mention that as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Eric.
Thank you, Jim. Eric Little from CalCCA. So you just mentioned the problem with the allocation. I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page on this, because it's actually even a bit worse than this. And I think this is what the gentleman from TEA was trying to get to. The CCAs get their primary amount of CRRs from load migration process, which means whatever the IOUs nominated, they get a slice of that. Then we go into the next year and there's a priority nomination process, which says, well, what you got last year, you get a priority towards those, and anything else that you want to ask for has to come in the later phases when a lot of stuff is already taken up. So to try to transition from what the utility gave you to what you need for your own portfolio is a pretty cumbersome process to be able to get there, which is a lot of the reason why I think the gentleman from TEA was saying the auction process is really important to CCAs, because they're trying to adjust their portfolio to what they actually need.
Mm-hmm.
So I just wanted to raise that to make sure that we had the full picture of the allocation process in mind.
Yeah, thanks. I didn't appreciate that part. So I had thought that the CCAs got their chunk of load and then would just go into the allocation process as having, 2% of California's load, and they get 2% of the CRRs. But that's not the case. They're actually just getting a chunk of the CRRs that are coming from the IOUs in whose territory they're located.
Right, and we do get a load ratio share, right? So
Sure.
Then the next time it comes about, right, this is very likely that the load migration has happened after the allocation process has already occurred. So the first one is you get this slice. The problem really is in that second one, because recall the ISO set up a system where they said, okay, the first time we went about doing this, we gave you an allocation and you had to prove that you had a source, you had a contract with a resource at that source, and that you had load at the sink, right? And after the first year, the ISO said, we don't want to do that anymore. It's a hassle. And I can understand why you wouldn't want to do that annually. So they put in place this system where they said, well, okay, but if I had a contract, I probably still have that contract. So I ought to be able to get that CRR again. And then I ought to be able to move part of my portfolio. Well, that's the system that we have in place. Well, when you have load migration to a CCA, I get the utilities bundled portfolio. I get my slice of that. And then the next year, when it comes to what's my priority nomination, I didn't have anything that I selected last year. So I'm stuck with the either I don't ask for anything because none of that met my needs, and I wait until the second round. But when I wait until the second round, all of the other LSEs have already gone and potentially taken the points that I want, and I might just miss out on CRRs altogether. So you've got to balance this. Okay, I'm going to get something in that priority nomination process. It may not be what I need, but it has value and I can try to trade it for something else later, or I can give it up right now and maybe get something in round two and maybe not.
Okay.
So they're stuck with a decision to make on what has the best value for their customers.
Okay, thanks for fleshing that out. Yeah, I'll come again. The high level observation I've had here is anything that sort of puts restrictions on the auction process increases the import of the allocation process. And I think the allocation process deserves some scrutiny then, especially if we follow through on further restrictions on the auction process is kind of the high level point. All right, so I'm going to try to go fast over some data things here. I think this is probably most people are aware of this. I've got a whole lot of LMP data and then 3 years worth of CRR data that is not quite what Hillary was showing. She's got more up to date. I've got 3 years from 22 to 24, and I focused only on the monthly just because I was doing this really fast at the last minute and so didn't have like the full ability to try to throw this together. And so I don't want to vouch that there's no mistakes here, and I just want to sort of put some qualifications on that this is the on-peak monthlies. And as we saw, I think from Hillary's data, these prices tend to be a little bit higher. I actually don't quite remember how the shortfalls compare. Anyways, I think this stylized fact is true though, that if you think about where like payoffs become, on average, it's true that payoffs are greater than the auction revenues, even after adjusting for the Phase 1B revenue inadequacy clawbacks. And but that is extremely concentrated in a few really big payoffs. And so if we were really thinking about, how do we just, if all we cared about was trying to, deal with the auction revenue shortfall, one way to do it would be to just truncate the maximum payout. But that's kind of like saying, if I drew this picture with fire insurance, then the payouts for people whose houses burned down would look a lot bigger than everybody else, which it kind of understates the point of you want to have a hedge against something that could get really bad, and if it gets really, really bad, the hedge becomes that much more valuable. But so I'm not sure what to, what to do with this stylized fact, but the stylized fact is that the payoffs are heavily concentrated, or the excess payoffs are heavily concentrated, and that almost highlights, I'm not kind of measuring uncertainty here, but it's a sort of corollary to the fact that there's a low probability, high sort of cost or benefit, depending on your position here, to some nodal price differences. And then if we think about the minimum price proposal, some of this I think has been fleshed out a little bit more. And I said this earlier, when the MSC talked about this, and I forget exactly when, I think it was maybe back to 2018 when we first started sort of kicking around the idea, it really was, my memory, and I'm pretty sure this is right, was motivated by this hypothesis that there was this disproportionate amount of auction shortfalls that were concentrated in low price CRRs that won the lottery. They paid very little, and then they got some congestion payoff when congestion did come true. And under that idea, if that was the source of the disproportionate amount of the shortfall, then a minimum price could yield a disproportionate amount of the solution to that problem. And so that's the background and the motivation. But subsequent analysis, Hillary showed some of this, shows that this may not, in fact, be the case. I was trying to do a few more cuts of this to try to convince myself, and this is partial. So low price CRRs are certainly not responsible for a majority or a disproportionate amount of the auction revenue shortfalls. The straw proposal has a quote in here about there not being a consistent pattern. And so that means that cutting off these low price CRRs, even if it doesn't cause any kind of secondary unintended effects, that if we want to reduce a very large amount of the revenue shortfalls, that would mean we'd have to reduce a very large amount of the actual CRRs being sold in the auction, rather than the other way around. And then, as I think it's been brought up a couple times, there's this potential risk where if people actually do stop participating because of the unappealingness of the price floors and the bid floors, then you could have fewer binding constraints, and that could lead to lower auction revenues. Now, in my mind, this is sort of a trade-off where a bunch of the zeros might be brought up to 1 or 50 cents, whatever the minimum price is. The volume, I assume, would be lower. And I think the big question is, how much lower would that be? So there is possibly increased revenue from, things that we're clearing below the price floor up to the price floor. The quantities would go down, but there also might be this complicated interactive effect of with just less participants overall, maybe a bunch of other constraints that we're clearing at higher prices end up, other constraints become unbinding, and so other CRRs end up clearing at lower revenues. And I think it's been said a couple times that it's a complicated interaction, that running some simulations or some backward-looking auction outcomes is something that should be done if this goes forward. Okay, so this is some cuts of data, very preliminary. The extent of quality control here is my cat sniffed the slides and did not throw up on them or something like that. So that there's really kind of very preliminary. We had these are auction results from the 2022 through 2024 period. Right now, I'm going to focus only on monthly auction results. I'm going to show you something that sometimes is labeled as expected. It's really, that's a misnomer. What it is the long run average for every CRR that clears. And I isolate what I call the popular CRRs And that's over the course of this 3-year period. If the total amount sold in any seasonal or monthly auction adds up to 50 megawatts, so it could be 1 in 1 month and 10 in another month and so forth. If in aggregate it adds up to 50, I call that a popular CRR. And it gets about 93% of the cleared megawatts with that screen. So looking at that, I then look at the realized or the marginal congestion cost component differences of each of CRR sync source nodes in that popular universe. And I'm going to call that sort of the average payout or the expected payout, which is a misnomer again. And then I tried to plot the per sale auction purchase, and I limit this to only the buy bids. So if you look at the data, there's auctions, there's allocations. So these are buy bids in the auction, monthly term on peak. And the payouts are calculated as the average hourly marginal congestion cost difference. And both the auction price and the payout are normalized to dollars per megawatt hour. Very importantly, there's no clawbacks included here. The data, I don't have access to those data, and they're really a mess as far as I understand. It's much easier to sort of look at the nominal values. Okay, so a few things that came out of this. I'm not sure quite what to make of it, but basically the expensive CRRs end up, and this I guess shouldn't be surprising, but the expensive CRRs end up losing money compared to their long run average value. The cheaper CRRs are the ones that can make more money. If it's a dot that's to the kind of upper left of this 45-degree line, that's one that's sold for a price below what the long run average value turned out to be. And the guys over to the right of this 45-degree line sold for an average of sold for what turned out to be more than the average of that. And I have to look back at the data to see like who's actually bidding this much for a CRR or whether that was an error. I suspect some of these really high price payments are coming off like the following month off of a period where there was some really bad congestion. And so there's probably a dynamic adjustment happening here. In terms of trying to get a sense of how much we're kind of cutting out if we do the cuts at different levels. This is my version of Hillary's bar graphs, which for me was a little easier to visualize. Essentially what we've got here is as we move to the right, it's the auction clearing price, again, in the monthly auctions. And as we move to the top, we're sort of building the distribution where we end up at 100% as we get to the far right here. And so we're basically kind of seeing how quickly the amount of CRR sold rises with the clearing price over this 3-year period. And basically, if we cut it at 25 cents, it's about 38%. And so Hillary's numbers were a little different, but she's looking at a different sort of sample here. But I think kind of overall, they're kind of in the same ballpark, though. At $1, I think she was closer to 50%. In the monthly auctions, I'm getting something closer to 60%. And so that implies that if we set it at $1, we could be eliminating certainly more than half, maybe up to 2/3 of the volume if the bids don't adjust. And the question there becomes on, well, what actually are the bids? And we'll see if I'm going to show you my stylized mental model of this translated into a picture as to two possible sort of states of the world here. These are two different CRR kind of possibilities that are both clearing at 0. And so, of course, I'm drawing a vertical line here at the available capacity, which is a simplification because we've got a simultaneous feasibility test going on here. But in the world of SFT, you know, this little chunk of the world is available for these CRRs. And they're both clearing where demand is less than the available capacity at a price of 0. And so the idea for this is, all right, we're going to raise that clearing price up to some minimum. That's the horizontal green dashed line. And really, I think the question I would like to know the answer to is, are we in a world that looks more like the right-hand picture, where all the bids are actually below that minimum price? And so if we raise the minimum price up to the green line, we're basically eliminating all of the CRRs that were that people were interested in buying. Or is it more like the left-hand picture, where there were a bunch of people who actually were willing to pay quite a bit for these specific CRRs, but because there just was more capacity than there was demand, we end up with actually those people earning quite a bit of auction surplus out of it. And this, I think the simplification translates, but this is kind of the general idea I was hoping to get more information out of the auction for, which you really have to dive into the bids to get a sense of. If we're in the left-hand world, then implementing a bid floor or a price floor will still keep quite a bit of the volume, because there was quite a bit of the actual demand mass that had a value above that minimum price. And they were enjoying the fact that the price was zero, but they'd still be willing to participate even if the price was raised up to that. But if we're in the right-hand world, then, well, on the one hand, there wasn't a lot of value to those guys, I guess, but we are reducing volume by quite a bit, basically to zero, by raising that minimum price. Okay, we had a hand raised by Todd. I'll take that question now.
Good afternoon. Todd Ryan with Pacific Gas and Electric. Looking at the cleared feasible set, the size of the set that is feasible out of the simultaneous feasibility test.
Yeah.
The size coming out of the auction is about, well, pre-CRR1B was 4 times on average, 3 to 4 times greater than the size of the feasible set coming out of the allocation. In recent years, that feasible set out of the auction is about 1.4 times the size of the feasible set coming out of the allocation. And so I guess my point is, we have the same transmission network, more or less, between the allocation process and these auctions. Is it necessarily a bad thing to have a small dip or maybe a reduction in the volume of CRRs that are coming out of the auction, as it seems like we have a quantity problem? We're allowing too many CRRs to clear.
Okay, so let me just backtrack to the stylized fact. So I think you said, and when we talk about quantities, you're just kind of saying megawatts kind of added up all together.
Correct.
And so the amount that was awarded in the auction, or would you take auction plus allocation?
I took the total allocation and grossed up for the fact that there was only 65% allocated. So I get the estimate of the total feasible set size. And then same with out of the auction, we're using an 82.5% adjustment. And so you're looking at the same transmission system and a different feasible set of CRRs, and they're significantly different in size. Pre-CRR1B, it averaged a factor of 3 times larger than the allocated feasible set. And post-CRR1B, it's closer to 1.4, though it varies very closely with auction insufficiency, or revenue insufficiency. So I guess my point being is, like, I hear you're saying that we could lose participation in the auction. Is that necessarily a problem if we're already giving away too many CRRs?
Yeah, and I guess this is this came up actually earlier. I think it was Seth, but so one of the retorts to the observation that we could end up basically driving auction revenue to zero, I think there are some stakeholders who would be fine with that, because it would mean there's nothing being sold in the auction. So that's one perspective. Yeah, I guess I'm trying not to take necessarily a stand on which of these two worlds is better, but I would like to know which one we're in. Because I think the left-hand world is one in which the auction would still raise additional revenue. And I guess if you view every CRR as a loser and you just don't want to sell any of them, then maybe you'd rather be in the right-hand world. But I do think, in terms of evaluating where the minimum price is, I would like to know sort of which world we're in.
Thanks.
Doug. who I think you were the author of the study that Michelle was citing.
Yeah,
earlier.
Doug
Is that correct?
Bocignone from Flume Resource Consultants for BAMX. Yeah, to sort of back up what Todd said, the 2024 auction data that we looked at, there were 240 terawatt hours of auction by CRRs. And that year, the allocation, there were 183 terawatt hours of allocated CRRs. So this is seasonal and monthly combined. So there were.
And this is awarded?
Awarded, cleared, held by parties. And there were, of the 183 terawatt hours allocated, 43 were sold in the auctions by LSCs that got allocated them. And that was like 3/4 of the total sell side CRRs that year. So I think the auction still is bigger than the allocation, or at least it was in 2024. I haven't looked at 25. And just for perspective, the CAISO gross load in 2024, or forecast gross load, was 205 terawatt hours. So, the combined allocation and auction CRRs are, multiples of the actual physical market. And I think what Michelle was referencing is we found that 90% of the auction CRRs were held by parties that transacted only 10% of the physical EQR energy, reported at FERC. So, most of the auction CRRs are not directly supporting hedging. They can't be. They're held by people who aren't trading any energy. Now, maybe they're doing some other magic on the side that is yet to be demonstrated. I don't think they are. But the hedging participants, they're able to get the CRRs that they've been seeking. And then to the slide you have here, it seems like we must be in the left-hand side of the world, right? People have a big curve that even with the analysis you did showed that there's, at those three different levels, you're still clearing, about half of the volume, right? So we're not on the right side where none would clear.
Well, I guess, so the idea of this figure, though, is that this is highlighting one specific CRR. And so if this might be a CRR that's on the left-hand side of my cumulative distribution curve that was clearing at zero, basically. Yeah. And it's more like, what are the component demands behind that?
I got you. Well, but to that point, I think, we've done some analysis of those, the three levels proposed in the straw proposal. And it is only a fraction of the total, the lowest level. And I think we're seeing, ignoring the price effects of the different bidding that might happen, that that group 3, the highest price they had, it would cover about 20 million of the auction shortfall, which is, I don't know, what is that, like 20% of the total, 15, 20%. But when you think about it from a value standpoint, that's 20% of that shortfall on something that people were risking hardly any money at all, right? It's as a percentage of the value of the CRR, it's a huge percent. That the more highly valued paths wouldn't be affected by these prices, the price floor, but they would, I'd argue, people are stepping up and doing something. They're putting some dollars out. Whereas the stuff around zero, what are we getting for that? So I think we might be getting more bang for our buck with these relatively low price floors.
Well, okay, so and I think that let me see if I'll show you a couple things here and see if that kind of jives. And is this stuff that will be in your coming comments, or is this already posted in comments?
Yeah, we'll put them in our comments that are due next week.
Yeah. All right, so what I did, and again, this is sort of with only a subset of them, but I think the number here was at $1 cutoff, you got 62%. At 25 cents, you got 38% of the CRRs awarded. And then I tried to compare that to the payout. So this is not the shortfall, but but I guess we're talking about, yeah, if I'd had more time, I would have tried to process the shortfall too. But basically, just in terms of the payouts, about 23% of the realized payouts are in these extremely low priced CRRs. And I guess you're right that that's a bigger margin because they're paying less for them. But this was 38% of the CRRs, translating to 23% of the payouts, which was not kind of the image I had in my head, or that when we thought of like the big part of the shortfall coming from all these low price CRRs, that in fact there's more meat in the middle there, where it looks like on this subset, at least I got that about 50% of the payoff goes to the dollar CRRs. And so we would get rid of 50% of the payouts. What the change in auction revenue would be, I didn't calculate, and would depend upon that. And actually, even the change in the payouts, again, depends upon exactly what this demand curve ends up looking like. But from this, it's they're roughly proportional, or even a little more skewed, where the payouts are actually tilted more slightly towards the higher end. But I think another calculation that I didn't do in terms of what the difference is, that 75-cent difference between 25 cents and $1 might make a difference there if we wanted to sort of draw this in terms of the surplus that is earned in payouts over the sale price as well.
Jim, so we've done some more of this analysis, and we looked at the impact on the notional, on the cost.
Yeah.
And roughly the same numbers, around 50%, but only reduces the payments in the auction by around 10 to 20%. So not surprising, right? The more valuable CRRs are still clearing.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. So I think you do get kind of a big bang for the buck.
Yeah.
These relatively low limits.
And I mean, back to the sort of cost benefit framing, if we're in this world, we are not kicking these guys out, because they expressed a high value here to owning a CRR. And if this is designed in a way that works, I still have some questions on that, then they would actually still be allowed to participate. And so the appeal of having the cutoff price is that you are actually, the people that are not participating are by definition the ones whose value is below where the cutoff value would be. Let's see. Okay, so I think these points have been made, just fleshing out the details of the auction here. And again, I think the consideration again is how large this bidder surplus is, measured as the difference between the upper part of my demand curves there and the market clearing price. If we're preserving a lot of that, then that is more appealing, but it might actually give you less of a savings in terms of the payouts, because there'd still be a reasonable amount of CRR sold. And I started thinking about this as like, are we approaching pay as bid CRRs here if we start sort of getting rid of everybody who bid a low price, but keeping the people who bid a high price? Not that I would suggest that, but at a high level, I was trying to think about what that implies. Turning to the allocation process, I think there's a couple dimensions I wanted to touch on here. And the first is, and several people have already raised this, what exactly does this mean for the entities that get CRRs from the allocation process? And what percentage of low price CRR sales can be traced back to allocated CRRs? And I was going to say, is this even calculable given that there's reconfigurations? But I think we do see in the data the entities that are selling. And I think the entities are selling. I think the data also cuts them as selling an allocated CRR. In fact, I think they have to have an allocation if they're selling. So there might be a way to sort of track how many of those sales are selling at actually below this. And that's just kind of a rough screen to kind of tell how much of these sales. The previous slide was actually looking only at auctions, so that none of the people here are actually, some of these auction purchases are coming from sales of allocated, I should say. But I think it would be good to know, are we kicking out a bunch of willing sellers, if you will, who got allocated CRRs and were then offering them in the monthly market? And if we are doing that, is that a desirable outcome? I've been hearing from most people today that it's not a desirable outcome to protect LSEs from selling at low prices. I think maybe the sentiment divides more between an unpleasant but tolerable side effect versus one that's a real concern. But it did make me wonder if there is a way to apply a minimum price only to not just on the bids, but to the prices of the additional capacity that's being made available in the auction phase, but somehow separate out the market clearing prices that can be traced back to LSE sells. It's really not obvious how you do that, because there's, the CRRs in most cases that are sold are getting reconfigured in some way. And so how exactly you would do that, I'm not sure off the top of my head. That's why we have smarter people than me joining the MSC. And it may not be practical. It's probably not something that could be derived in the next 6 weeks. And in lieu of that, the ISO has raised this, that there's always a secondary market. And so if we are kind of cutting LSEs out from the auction, they can always go to the secondary market. Is that an adequate substitute, though? Because it really, I think, makes reconfiguration difficult to impossible if you want to. I mean, there could be a secondary market that runs its own kind of mini auction, but that still involves more of a matching of nodes than it would be the kind of combination of existing submitted allocated capacity that would be mixed together with some of the additional capacity that is released in the auction. So I don't think it's clearly not a one-for-one substitute. I think it's an inferior substitute. Whether it's adequate or not is something that I'd be curious to hear stakeholders' reactions to. And then along those lines, one chunk of these allocated CRRs are these long-term CRRs. And I think what Eric was describing, I think it traced back to certainly the origins of long-term CRRs. I wasn't quite clear if that also involved some of the shorter term allocations as well. But these are all sort of things that came up, and I think some stakeholders have raised them as well, and it would be good for the ISO to think about. I think, in my mind, if there was a way to somehow allow the allocated CRRs to be sold at whatever price they want, and somehow apply a tax only to the additional capacity that's being released in the auction phase, that is kind of more consistent with the spirit of I think what the intent is, that I think Don Trethewey articulated, even though as an intent, I'm not sure he agreed with that intent, of not trying to punish or even tax the transactions that are kind of coming out of the allocation phase, but somehow eliminate the low-cost speculative purchases that happen in the auction phase alone. And just teeing that up, I'm not sure if there's an easy technical solution there, but I think it would be desirable if there was. And then more broadly, stepping back to the allocation process, I just think this focus on the auction and the auction revenue shortfalls has really kind of taken all the oxygen away from a broader question, which is how the allocation process itself functions and whether we should take a look at that. Because as I understand the allocation process, it's not one that an economist would think should lead to the most efficient outcomes. And just on basic market design principles, how you would define that is, could be debated, but I do think there's some potential issues that include the equity. Is it the case that some LSCs are getting really far more valuable CRRs out of this than others? And then there's the efficiency issues, which Eric actually brought up a whole other one that I wasn't aware of, which is kind of taking on CRRs that really you don't want or that are a bad fit for your needs. And having to sort of reconfigure from that. But also there's the potential, which Michelle's rules are intended to try to prevent, of basically the allocation process causing herding to high value CRRs that are just attractive because the rationing in the allocation phase is based on megawatts, not based on the underlying expected value of the CRR. And so if people were totally free to choose whatever they wanted and were just profit maximizing, everybody would start to nominate the most valuable CRRs and forget about whatever they were interested in that matched their contract positions. Now, there are a bunch of rules trying to discourage that sort of behavior, but I'm unaware of analysis that's really looked at that. And I just raise all these points not as in a spirit of whataboutism, but more in the spirit of any initiative that reduces the amount of CRR capacity or even raises the cost of CRR capacity available in the auctions, I think increases the stakes, or at least in the extreme, it increases the share of allowances that are created through the allocation process. And as Doug was saying, I have to look at this some more. It's actually still a minority of the allowances, even though it's a majority of the capacity that's being made available through the process. All right, so this is just a plea to let's think about allocation as well. In my mind, a ARR sort of setup is an appealing thought that might sort of deal with some of these other issues, but would be a major redesign consideration. And I'd have to sort of go back to why load serving entities resisted the ARR approach back when this first two-stage design was implemented. Secondary markets. So basically, this is kind of just trying to say, if we drive people out of the auction, they're going to have to rely on secondary markets. I think there is a group of stakeholders who believe that there are financial entities sort of there who will step in and provide kind of synthetic CRRs that aren't backed by actual congestion revenues. I just don't know. I'm a little dubious about that, but I'm unaware of, again, markets that have a lot of that sort of situation that have non-covered entities providing kind of synthetic CRRs. All right, then finally, we actually got this far. We're at hour 3.5, and we haven't really talked much about revenue inadequacy. So I want to touch on that in a couple dimensions. The first is that I'll beat a horse I've beaten a couple times, where we have a really aggressive approach to revenue inadequacy, and I think that's because this process has really focused on the fact that the payouts are way in excess of what the auction prices were, and one solution to that would be to raise the auction prices. Another would be to reduce the payouts. And phase 1B did have the effect of reducing the payouts. And so on average, that has had that desired, it has had that effect, let's put it that way. I do worry, and I've said this before, that this creates a lot of additional uncertainty about the value of any individual CRR and how how much we're degrading the underlying value of this, both for folks receiving allocations as well as those participating in the auction. And whenever we do this sort of analysis, I've seen this quoted a few times that, oh yes, well, we reduced the payouts and that's helped with the auction inefficiency, but that's kind of missing the counterfactual of I would assume that the willingness to bid in the auction must be reduced by exposure to increased clawback risk. And there's two, I'm not raising anything new here, but there's two aspects of this. One actually is one that's gotten a lot of attention, is the revenue adequacy itself is still really big and kind of has been this persistent thorn that I think that is not just a problem to the CRR market, but potentially a sort of symptom of other underlying mysterious potential issues with the market that really deserve attention. We've talked about loop flow. We didn't get a chance to really talk about shift factor truncation. We've had a little bit of an offline discussion about whether that's something that could be dealt with. But reducing the revenue inadequacy is just a pure win, I think, for all different sides of this. It would make the amount of the haircuts smaller. It, I think, would increase auction revenues because it would make the risk of buying and holding a CRR lower, and should deserve a decent amount of focus. If it's not something we can deal with in the next 6 weeks, that's sort of unfortunate. But I do want to kind of keep pressure on the ISO to try to really deal with the revenue inadequacy. An ancillary point that has gotten a lot less popular response. Everybody loves reducing revenue inadequacy. For the most part, I haven't heard a lot of favorable response to changing the haircut method from this targeted constraint by constraint method to something that just is more of a global haircut to all CRR holders. I think that would reduce, or I'd like to at least see some numbers about what the implied sort of risk exposure of the two different approaches would look like. All right, so we don't have a lot of time, so I don't want to focus too much on that, but I will say on the, let's see, I can't remember what my next slide's going to be. Yeah, let me say one other thing about revenue inadequacy, since a couple people have brought up shift factors. I do think this is worthy of a further discussion. I am a simple industrial engineer. I've been trying to talk to some electrical engineers who can explain this stuff better to me. But I've been a little confused as to why the shift factor problem is so, that the reasons why we can't pursue a solution to the shift factor problem, as far as I understand it, has been articulated as, well, we can't computationally lower the shift factor cutoff in the day-ahead market, that it would just cause too many computational problems. I think through spillover linkages, we want to have the day-ahead market sort of run the same model as the real-time market, and so it's more of a computational issue in real time. But what has eluded me is why we can't do a more faithful recreation of the IFM solution in the CRR auction itself. And this is where the electrical engineers have been trying to explain to me. But that is, I think, trying to, I still am searching for whether there is a solution to the shift factor cutoff problem that does not involve changing the IFM. That if there is some way of trying to better mimic what's happening in the IFM in the CRR pricing round, that would be desirable if there's a way to do that. And in general, then I do come back to this sort of idea of we kind of tried to grab revenue inadequacy and auction shortfalls wherever we can, and that's had the effect of really reducing the value of the CRRs that are sold. And at some point, we make it so bad that, is there any point to CRRs anymore if they become anti-hedges in a way? We're maybe not quite to that point, but I do worry about it. And that does sort of come back to a high level principle I've thought about is it seems to make more sense and really benefit everybody to if shortfalls are intolerable or some degree of shortfalls are intolerable, it probably makes sense to just sell less CRRs, but make them of higher quality, rather than trying to sort of degrade the value of all the CRRs. And there are different ways to try to get at that. But I do think that's something that makes sense at a high level for me. Now, reducing the inadequacies, though, would really help on many fronts for that reason. And I do worry that, we didn't, that it's maybe representative that I didn't even get to this until 3.5 hours into our CRR call, that we hadn't really talked about revenue inadequacy. All right, so to summarize, cost benefit, we sort of covered that. I think there is, I'm not unpersuaded by the stuff that Doug and Michelle have mentioned, that there is sort of a weak link between measured contract activity and CRRs. I don't know enough about the EQR data set to really know how to consume those facts. But it is something that that I am, I do find valuable information. I think the discussion today has sort of pointed to that the minimum price proposal may not achieve its goals. I think there are a bunch of different goals, though, so we don't quite know. It's going to achieve somebody's goals, I guess, but it might not achieve the majority of the people's goals. And I would like to know more about what will actually happen if we implement this. And as we've talked about, a first step here would be to try to look at the, rerunning some past auctions with different minimum price thresholds imposed. And that doesn't even look at sort of different aspects of this, like people starting to put in strategic counterflow bids in ways that we were kind of trying to talk through in real time earlier. I still put in an appeal here that the allocation process is something we should think about, but also at a high level, there's sort of this question of how do we preserve the opportunities for entities that have allocated CRRs to sort of transact as freely as they want, while limiting the undesirable aspects of the sales of CAISO, of the additional auction capacity that's been set aside for the auction. And then revenue accuracy, I'm against it. So there should be a way to try to reduce. Well, I do think we really need to kind of keep focusing on this to try to really identify some sources of this. And I think it hasn't come up, but the congestion revenue allocation track, once we start thinking about sending some congestion revenues to other balancing authorities and vice versa, or not sending it, is going to have an additional effect on CRRs that I don't think is going to be a huge, or I hope isn't going to be a huge issue in maybe this next round, but could become a really big concern that I think we need to kind of wrap into this maybe by the time we get to the next major auction in 2020 for that would be in 2027 for the 2028 period. All right, so that's a whole bunch of points. I want to give Ross and or Jacob an opportunity to react if you have any thoughts. Ben would always do this to me, and I'd be like, so if that's kind of your reaction, that's fine too. But I want to give you the opportunity if you have any additional thoughts here, and then we'll see if there's any more comments, questions from the stakeholders.
I suppose one thing I'll add is that I'm also interested in this question about long-term CRRs that you raised earlier. I believe that New Zealand had a nodal market from the inception and then introduced FTRs about 15 years into operating the market. So maybe I can learn something from reading about New Zealand. But that's all I'll add.
I've been there. I've studied it a lot, so I should. Yeah, you're correct about that. And I remember asking people this question, but I can't remember the answer. I think the answer, like, it's a side conversation we can have. But yes, that is a good example. There is one market that had, because you need this sort of secret. You need both nodal pricing. So there's a bunch of places that don't have CRRs, but they don't really have nodal pricing. And I think most places that move to nodal pricing introduce CRRs at the same time. Now, there's lots of different ways to create CRRs or to distribute them that might learn something. And I guess I've seen somewhere in the comments or the proposal that PJM has some version of a minimum price, although I then read that it applies only to option CRRs and not to obligation CRRs. So I don't know whether there's any valuable information there either.
Jim, I would just add that, as you know, there's been a little bit of discussion between Guillermo and me about shift factor issue. I don't think that's ready for prime time yet, but we've got some ongoing discussions that might affect the discrepancy in calculated flows in the IFM without perhaps a major rework of the minimum threshold. And I've also corresponded with you about a couple of the questions that you posed in your presentation. Again, that's not ready for prime time, but just to let you and others know that there's some discussion going on about that in the background.
Okay, I feel like this is a bit of a mess, but sort of hopefully an intellectually rewarding mess, not super structured here. So any other comments that people want to make? Now's a good time, or we may have successfully exhausted everybody. I will say,
as we gather last comments, I'll just thank everybody for their time today, and also mention that we have a comment deadline due that covers both our last straw proposal on this topic as well as the last meeting. And I believe that comment deadline is June 16th. So for anyone who's still on the call, thank you for your comments today, and thanks also for putting those in writing.
And a little bit of feedback there. So we got a couple hands, and I'll get to you in a second. I just want to say that we on the future agenda item front, we're tentatively working on a public meeting in mid-July, and just sort of follow whatever notifications of CAISO processes you follow to look for that. Okay, Todd has his hand up, so go ahead, Todd.
Todd Ryan with Pacific Gas and Electric. I wanted to ask a clarifying question on your point about having having fewer but higher quality CRRs. Are you talking about in the allocation phase, or are you talking about overall after the auction's all said and done, the total set of CRRs?
It's I'm not going to sort of I don't know is the answer. Because I think that there's different issues associated with it. I do think, let's just say we're talking about just reducing the number of auctioned CRRs, and maybe compensating and then getting rid of any clawbacks for the remainder. There could still then be revenue inadequacies that might be quite inequitable across different transmission owning or across different ratepayers, to the extent the allocation process yields inequitable results. And so it kind of comes down to like what definition of fair are we applying? Are we if it's one LSC who's earning rents at the expense of another LSC, is that okay? Or should we be as focused on that inequity as we are between, a power marketer and an LSC or something like that? But I could imagine different combinations of this, as I think you're kind of already gravitating to. I mean, similarly, you know, if one really simple way of trying to reduce the revenue shortfall instead of having a complicated minimum price would be to just auction less of the capacity. And I think there's maybe some legal issues associated with that I'm, again, not the expert on. But to the extent that we could offset the revenue inadequacy shortfalls by sort of having more of a I mean, if there's less CRRs out there, you can sort of absorb more of you're going to have less of a likelihood of having a revenue inadequacy, is kind of the simplistic kind of view. And then if there's less out there, we can do something more less extreme on the clawback front, is sort of the general margin of trade-off I was describing there. And I think that would help pretty much anybody, depending on how far we go in the reducing the CRR direction.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. CD McLean.
Good afternoon. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Excellent. Christopher McLean, staff, California Energy Commission. Just wanted to observe that various modes of chat are turned off. To the extent that chat is information and information is valuable, the MSC may want to reconsider. I don't know if it's your prerogative or the ISO's prerogative, reconsider choices around whether the chat is open or closed.
Okay. To be honest, I just noticed there's a chat button in the bottom of the screen. I hadn't really paid attention to it. So it wasn't a conscious decision on my part, at least. And we will kind of huddle on exactly what the protocol is, but I take your comment and we'll see what our consensus is there. All right. Absent any other comments, did I cover the future agenda items in the correct way, Amelia, or anyone?
I believe you did.
Okay.
There are currently no public MSC meetings scheduled, except for a potential opinion call on this topic. But those will be posted and will be scheduled and posted as they are scheduled.
Yeah, and just as a process question, in order for anything to happen for the for this auction round, this seasonal auction round, the July board meeting is basically the last decision opportunity.
For the 2027 auction, because the goal would be to make any changes that affected the auction in time for the allocation process.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, and the auction is run in around October timeframe, is that right? And when does the allocation phase start?
We usually time that from the beginning of the posting of the full network model, which I believe takes place in August, but I'll leave
Okay,
that
so yeah, this is
correction.
very, very tight. Okay. All right, thanks everyone. I really appreciated the discussion, and we will see you again soon. Look forward to seeing people's comments on this too. Thanks. And operator, I think we can end the public session.